Chapter 481. A Painful Separation, Part 2. Shin stood still for a few seconds. The warm breeze of the cozy space tugged at his body from all sides, making the entire space seemingly heavy all of a sudden. The atmosphere was rife with tension and both of them could feel it, although Shin more than Northern. He clenched his hands again and tried to suppress all the emotion that kept causing his heart to thump disturbingly. And he took another few moments to wallow in the thought of what to say to Northern, after which he raised his head and frowned his face slightly to build up confidence to say what it is, as it is. Through it all, Northern observed his father. All his disposition formed a visual emotion that Northern could see better than anyone would have. They further informed him that the problem had to carry a more significant weight than he had thought. He was already beginning to consider the worst case. And considering such worst case made him tense, like a large rock was pressing against it. Even he felt the pressure as much as Shin did. And all the atmosphere needed from both of them was for one of them to just open their damn mouth and talk. After another few moments again, Shin finally swallowed and started. "I caused it." His voice shook and he clenched his fist tighter again. "No, it's my cursed family." Northern widened his eyes a little bit at the mention of his family. He had a first-hand experience of how cursed they could be with how they breed a spawn like Raven. No sane family would raise a child like that or in that manner. Shin continued, "If you remember, you wanted to know my family. You wanted to know their swordsmanship because I used to brag so much." Northern remembered very well and chuckled at the memory. Those were fun memories. It was quite sad how fate had stolen such beautiful moments and much better that could have been made from him. Northern listened to Shin as he resumed. "It was during her 3rd trimester. I believe she was very close to childbirth. And they found me." His breath was shaky. A pale smile deformed his face. "Of course, Aisha knew of my past. However, she only knew what I was running away from. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know that I used to be exactly what I was running away from. And the sad part of it all was that when we first met each other, she didn't judge me and had trusted me to be naked with her as she was with me. But you weren't." Northern stared at him squarely and then let out a disappointed sigh before saying, "So, what more?" Shin looked at Northern, briefly surprised. "What? I know that might have been enough to hurt her so much, but I don't think it's enough to make her leave." Shin raised a brow, puzzled and shocked. "How did you know about her leaving?" "Judging by the way your story is going, I figured she's not dead. The worst case that can have you broken like this means she left. I mean, look at your jaws, roughened by stubbles of beards. Your eyes look like they have lost purpose and you have just been trying to suppress everything. Every time you come here, stopping by the door and taking a deep breath before coming in like I'm some kid you need to smile at and tell, 'All is good.'" Shin's mouth fell and Northern continued, his gaze growing deep with fury. "I don't need your protection. I've not had it for the past few months being in hell, and you want to know the worst part? Your reluctance to teach me about your world almost had me killed more often than not. So the least I need you doing right now is trying to present this information in a version that you are currently thinking would be bearable for a kid my age. Don't do it." Shin's mouth was slightly opened in astonishment. Northern had just released words that gutted him from all directions. He gulped and tried to stand better, repositioning himself as he went over all Northern had said. All those moments that he'd take to suppress the bitterness he felt and smile for this kid. Apparently the very same kid knew of it all. And his reluctance to teach him their world almost killed him more often than not. Regret assaulted him internally like a jarring titanic spear striking down upon his mortal frame. The least he could do right now was actually be completely honest with this kid. He is so not a kid anymore. Shin looked at his son and said, "You certainly have changed. And it's quite sad that it all happened without my influence and contribution." Northern looked away slightly. The atmosphere felt like it had turned on him. Shin's words took reins of the wistful air. "It wasn't entirely without your contribution. Our daily drills went a long way in helping me stay alive at the very least." His words sounded suppressed and muffled, but Shin heard them clearly. And hearing them only made him feel worse, but appreciating what Northern was trying to do. He sucked it all up and continued, The Kageyama clan is a family of assassins. They operate almost as a kingdom. They have vassal families that serve and honor them. They train soldiers in the main family and in the branch family, all of them strictly committed to learning the Kageyama family arts, which takes on different forms. There's much to tell about the family, but I'll say it's a vile place for a child to be birthed and raised. Sadly, my brother and I were birthed and raised in such a place. He paused. Reflecting back on his life in the clan brought a film of memories that left a bitter taste in his mouth. Our father was a vicious patriarch. Well, every patriarch is vicious, except that my father was more vicious because he kept giving birth to girls. He looked at Northern, who was about to say something but paused as Shin took the words right out of his mouth. It's not supposed to be a bad thing, but there's a written law in the family that prohibits a woman from ever becoming a patriarch. It's simply tradition. Should the patriarch fail to give birth to a male child, the mantle of the crow will depart from him and go to another branch family. His family will become the branch family while another family becomes the main family. Everything will turn around and the focal point will become the family with the mantle. I see, so it really is a big deal that he had no female child. Was the first patriarch a misogynist? So when my father gave birth to my elder brother and I, he became very hard on both of us. I'm saying, save the family's crude ways, he was even harder. He had 9 daughters before my brother and I, so when I say he was hard, you can't even fathom. Those memories resurfaced as he spoke, wearing a slight frown upon his face. While things were specially hard for my brother and I in general, there was a certain degree of hard between the both of us. And mine outweighed his, simply because I had something he didn't. Shin looked at Northern, his face serious without a shred of triviality. Then he said, I was referred to as a genius. Unknowingly, Northern blurted out, Sorry, you were what now? Chapter 482. A Painful Separation, Part 3. Of course, Shin could understand where Northern's shock came from. While he said he had a genius intellect, the talent he had managed to awaken was at first considered mundane. But the thing about the clan was that they didn't place any importance on talent and talent abilities. As long as one had soul essence and could move superhumanly, the Kageyama arts were more than enough for a scion of the clan to be as strong as any drifter out there. However, this kind of strength was only significant in assassination or human confrontation. Northern closed his mouth for a moment and then opened it. I apologize for the way I sounded. The atmosphere was kind of serious. His initial response almost seemed like a ridicule to his father and the seriousness of the matter at hand. But it was Shin, and he understood Northern very well. He smiled and said, I understand where the shock came from. What you know of me is what I portray to you. It is the same thing with everyone else. And this is the kind of life I have been living so that my elder brother could succeed my father and not me. Northern opened his mouth slightly. I see. Shin was obviously telling no lie. His breathing pattern was regular and clear, which made Northern think back on the past events as he grew up. He had seen Shin maneuver through several situations. It was always not easy. He would struggle. The fight with the beast was just one of them. Shin would struggle with the monster before eventually killing it. Even at times during the hunting, it was always like this. So Northern was used to thinking that even though his father was indeed a good fighter that had the basics ingrained into his muscles, he was a weak drifter. But now that Northern was thinking about it from a new perspective, so, all those fights have been him portraying a weak person to me? Northern almost wanted to disagree with his father and call it bluffing. It's just so impossible to portray weakness so accurately in that manner. He managed to deceive. Northern shook his head internally. No way. Then something occurred to him. He moved his eyes to meet Shin's. When you say you are a genius, what exactly do you mean? It's not difficult to think about. I have a very rare sense of adaptability. In the entire clan, I am the only one in 7 generations that had managed to customize the clan art to his own specifics. Northern raised his head slightly as he finally understood what was coming from, and then it all made sense. If Shin had such adaptability sense, then it would make sense that he was able to reduce himself to subpar just to make people feel he wasn't good enough. A strong person can pretend to be weak, but a weak person cannot pretend to be strong. Northern sighed. Everything kind of made sense now, but there was still one question that bothered him. He stared at Shin, then asked, "But why? You were already away from the clan. You were in some remote place." Shin breathed in and out. "When you do something for so long, it becomes a habit. And I kind of enjoyed it. The Kageyama art brings me nothing but misery. Then after doing all this favor for your brother, so he could become the patriarch, I'm assuming your plan worked, so what's wrong now?" "He wanted me to serve him as his right-hand man. That makes a lot of sense. Surely he wouldn't want to let a resource like you go." Shin glanced at Northern strangely upon his response before carrying on. "I started messing up missions intentionally. It was my way of throwing tantrums, but it was messing up the family's reputation. When it got so much, my brother couldn't have it anymore. Then he shipped me to the border." Northern nodded as he followed. With Shin's pause, he inquired, "So, what part of all of this is enough story to mess up with Mother?" Shin sighed heavily. He lingered before speaking. "It's my acts while claiming to disrupt missions and the things I did in order to cause my brother, the patriarch, grief and worry, to become a disgrace to him." "Oh crap! What did you do, Shin?" Northern squinted his eyes. "Here it comes." Shin breathed shakily as he listed them out. "At a time, I was supposed to kill a certain queen. I raped her viciously and left it for the king to see. She hated herself so much she later hung herself to death." Northern's mouth fell. He was expecting something vicious when Shin said he messed up missions. But this? Northern suddenly felt his mind go blank for a moment. Shin continued anyway. "Another time, there was a petition for an entire lineage to be wiped off the face of this world. Not only did I not kill their last descendant, I gave her my seed. And the Kageyama does not just spread their seed to anyone." "By seed, you mean your—" Shin nodded, causing Northern's mouth to open to an O. Moments later, Northern managed to shake away the shock and asked, "So you have a child? A female child somewhere, yes?" Northern frowned. "That was what sent Mother away." Shin sighed. His breath shivered. "It wasn't the entire case. Your mother was angry that day and threatened to leave. But she didn't." Northern raised a brow. "She didn't leave?" Shin looked into Northern's eyes, his resonating with dark sadness. "My family finally approached me because they needed my help. I refused, and they used underhanded methods to bring my daughter before my eyes. Aisha was heartbroken and disappointed not because I had a child but because I never told her that I did. I mean, how could I have? I knew of her difficulty to give birth due to her race. I couldn't bring myself to tell her something that would have her heart wrench every time she thought about it. I wanted her to know we were in this together and I am not depending on some child somewhere." His voice broke in between words now and then as he spoke. "She entered the room and was going to get her important stuff. But when I entered to meet her, she was gone." Northern frowned. "What do you mean gone?" Shin looked at his son with his eyes barely holding in those burning tears. "Northern, your mother, Aisha was kidnapped 6 months ago." The room suddenly got darker. Chapter 483. What if it's all been fate? Everywhere suddenly grew cold. The level of coldness Shin was experiencing before now was child's play to this one. It was so intense that the cold seeped into his muscles and as far as his bone. The air became compressed, and at that moment, Shin felt like he was standing at the top of a very high mountain, where the air was quite scant and tense. There was an additional feeling of fear creeping into his heart, like the roof. No, the entire reality above him, even the sky, was going to come crashing down on him. All this was a matter of seconds since the last word was uttered, and in such a short time, pearls of sweat had formed over Shin's face. Northern belatedly looked at his father and quickly steadied his mind and breath at the same time. As he did, the void aura slowly calmed down, lessening its effect on the space. It was still there but suppressed by Northern himself. That one moment, he had unintentionally let go of the hold he had on it, causing the entire room to drown in the horror of the void aura. It was a curse that now accompanied him as he grew stronger. And perhaps, in some situations, it would be a blessing. Northern clenched his teeth painfully, shut his eyes, and looked away for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said to Shin, who was now breathing heavily like he had just run a 2-day marathon without stopping, his shoulders rising and falling. "It's fine." Shin spoke in a foggy tone and dealt with his breath at the same time. He slowly sat on the stool and breathed in and out several times till he got steady. Northern watched him from a sitting position. He had been sitting for a while now. After a while, when his father had calmed down, his voice rang out emotionlessly. "Did you look for her?" Shin frowned. The tone behind his question was so obvious. "You think I didn't? And why are you here? Why have you not found her? What has your family done to her?" Northern's tone was growing intense. He didn't know why, but there was a pile of hot flames that were burning at the base of his lungs, and any time he spoke, it was like they were rising to burst out of him. He tried to stop talking immediately. Shin scowled, but it was not towards Northern. His face was falling on the ground. After a few moments of silence, Northern heard his shaky voice. "I have searched. They weren't the ones. If they were the ones, I would have known already. But they really weren't the ones." As much as Northern was trying to stop himself from getting angry, Shin's response was like adding fuel to the seething flame beneath him. He glared at his father with a cold intensity etched in the depths of his eyes. "So?" Shin, regardless of the way Northern's response sounded to his ears, kept his head down, gritting his teeth and rubbing his hands together. He is as pained about this as Northern is. He had even had to carry this pain for so much longer. His son, his wife, his unborn child, which would probably be born by now, all suddenly disappeared from his life. It felt like everything he had worked so hard to build for himself, the life he had struggled so much to live, all suddenly became nothing in the blink of an eye. He felt nothing but darkness and misery consume his daily life. Utterly useless. "There is only one thing I keep thinking about, and it has to do with your mother's secret and the origin of her race." "That's right." He referred to her race before as if she wasn't human. Northern glanced at his father, as he realized there was something more to their story with this. Shin, with a bit of hesitation, continued to speak. "Aisha is not originally from this world." Northern raised a brow. Shin continued, oblivious of his son's expression. "I know this would sound so unbelievable, but while we were being truthful to each other, Aisha had told me that she comes from a world that was torn off from ours. She was running away from her father, and her arrival in this world was an accident. She called herself a being of the ancient wood, an elf." Northern's eyes widened at that moment. From the moment Shin started talking about another world, a single possibility had occurred to Northern. The underworld. It was a place he knew very little about, but at the very least, he knew it was a world that stood below Trail as a whole, and it had people living in it too. So when Shin mentioned another world, his mind quickly wandered off to the experience he had with Sura and Cal. "Are they characterized by long ears?" Remembering how Cal looked, Northern muttered. Shin looked at him, a small hint of confusion appearing in his eyes. "How did you know?" That was her true form, but she could use an ancient art called magic to hide her ears and make them human ears. Northern stood up, so many thoughts running around his mind as he washed down on his face with his palm. He stood frozen in thought for a couple of seconds before turning to Shin, who was looking at him with concern. Northern was essentially shocked at how interconnected all of this suddenly became. As much as he wanted to believe this was a coincidence and nothing more, his intuition was hinting at something else. The reason why Aisha was kidnapped all of a sudden might have had nothing to do with it, but his senses tickled. All these events, now that he thought about them, began to feel like someone was weaving him into something. Someone, fate. Northern had not held a strong philosophy on fate and its doings. He never really gave it a deep thought. He had never had a reason to before now. But right now, this realization suddenly triggered his sense to question everything he had experienced until this point. From the way he was born, to the event of his death, his parents, adopted mother who happens to be an elf, his awakening and its failure, being sent to the rift, his encounter with the vestige of the Chaos Prince, his annoying nemesis relationship with Kal, meeting Caladhel and Sura, learning about their world, and his intuition somehow told that there was more coming. And the more that was coming would intertwine Aisha's unborn, perhaps now born, child. Northern didn't know why at first, but he suddenly felt a need overwhelm him. He turned to Shin and said with a deep, calm gaze, "We need to find Mother as soon as we can." Chapter 484. The Plus One. Northern's new perspective on the run-through of how his entire life had been and the situations he had found himself in granted him the privilege to overlook certain things. Ruffsburg, for example, was a driving force to the beginning of his hell. But the beginning of that hell led him to meeting Kal, then to resealing Cryos. As a matter of fact, how had he not been sure that all those events of disaster had not been to the end that he would encounter Kal and seal Cryos again? After all, Cryos had been sealed there by the Origins themselves because it was impossible to kill him like they had killed the Chaos Prince. So it was possible that Fate, who Northern was to believe could be an Origin in this world, had intentionally played people like chess to move him towards accomplishing what it was they wanted. And perhaps it is playing some move again right now, pushing them towards a certain destination. As all these thoughts ran across Northern's mind, he felt they were wild and insane at the same time. But this was a new world. A world where powers like this exist, concepts can be twisted and maneuvered, and even he is an embodiment of the proof of it. So, how could he not believe this notion? It was something that he had never given thought to before. And now that he was actually thinking about it, he felt like his mind was being liberated from a shackle he never noticed or thought was present. Somehow, Northern felt like there was this new wave of control that he had over his mind, not to speak of the amazing perspective that this information flowed in with. If he was to be cocky, he'd say he suddenly began to feel sagacious. And it felt like this was because of his eyes. "My eyes are affecting my brain." Northern almost scoffed at the conclusion of his thoughts. He folded his arms and sighed again. He'd been sighing for a while since Shin had left his room after what he said. At first, Shin had been surprised by the tone of his words. But Northern quickly encouraged his father to find out how they could find clues whatsoever. Even though Shin didn't have any, he had informed Northern that there was a way to find information if that was needed. However, they would need to go to Southern Drywall. As to what was in Drywall, Shin had not explicitly said. But he had gone ahead to prepare all they needed to make the journey, which meant they would be leaving very soon. A few hours after Shin had left, Northern had found himself restless. That was how all the progression of thoughts started. Northern sighed, collecting every piece of his thoughts together, and focusing to one point what he intended to do going forward. There was not much way to go about it. If it was an entity as large as Fate that was moving him like a pawn, he needed to keep moving for now. But he was not going to just keep moving like he did before. If I had known that all I went through was to reseal Cryos, since it was an effect that couldn't have been undone, then I would have struck a deal with Kal and been an important part of his mission being accomplished. I refused to be anyone's tool. Saying that in his heart suddenly sent his mind racing through all the bad things he had been through with Raven. It was a personal decision that was birthed out of his desperation to go home. He didn't think they would use him like that. And when it indeed felt apparent that he was being used, he didn't care as long as he got to have what he bargained for. However, the destruction of the ship and the fact that Terrence knew all that was going to happen in that moment threw him off. At what point did she find out? Did they approach him knowing very well that he was never going to get what they bargained for? They deceived and used him, and at the end of the day made a great fool out of him. No, he was never going to forgive them. And thanks to this experience, his sense had suddenly sharpened to hatred at the thought of being used against his own consent. Be it fate or destiny, tyrants or origins, I will molest anyone that tries to play dirty with me. Now, all he had to do was play fool until he realized what it was that was the endpoint of this movement. Since it was involving the underworld, Northern was definite that it was going to be something magnanimous. Perhaps as magnanimous as Cryos. It's insane to think that these guys are using me to do some world repair of some sort. And here I was thinking that I wasn't under any radar. The more his thoughts progressed, the more revelation his mind opened to. And he didn't even see all of this before. He gains new eyes and it's like endless knowledge started pouring in. Northern felt confident, smart, and insightful. That was just a passive thing that his new eyes could do. He wanted to know more. He wanted to know more so bad. After a couple of days, Northern was finally ready to leave the border. By that time, Annette and Gilbert along with Au and Mew had already left. Several other people too had left. However, almost half of the population still inhabited the building. Howe had informed Northern that not all the natives of Starlock decided to march to the Central Plains. But he had specifically chosen to go because of his business. Staying in a dead continent served no purpose to a man that wants to build fortune, was the statement he had said to Northern. And with that, Northern had showed him his stack of soul cores. He, as a matter of fact, only showed him barely half of what he had. The Bottomless could not take any more, so he had created a room in the Void Palace where his clones were storing them. There were also the resources that were being mined from the mountain. Now that he was in the Central Plains, the first thing he wanted to focus on was building wealth, which he had several potential sources for. The red crystal was one, the two minerals that were gotten from the glacial mountain and the volcanic mountain were another. Although he had not seen a use for these materials, they each had special nature that made them different. The red crystal's healing properties. The volcanic crystal had a heating effect while the glacier crystal had a cooling effect. The glacier mountain crystal had a glass-like appearance and Northern suspected that it probably could be used for ornamental purposes. This was all just his speculation anyway, and he hadn't even told how about all these things save the soul core. He wanted to see if this is a man that can be trusted and if truly Howe's art of trading fitted well into the market of the Central Plains. If it didn't, he was not going to waste resources, but if he was, then all the trouble of saving him was worth it. Howe was, as expected, flabbergasted at the amount of soul cores Northern had. Northern explained his desire to make wealth and Howe was very pleased to accept this offer. Although he had also told Northern that what he knows of the Central Plain are from tales told by his merchant friends. He had a few contacts, but it was difficult getting to them from a state like this. In the end, he joined Northern and his father who were going to be leaving for Drywall. And so did Ellis. Although Ellis gave no certain reason, claiming that he just wanted to spend more time with his best friend before going home. Northern had cringed at being called best friend. The one person whom Northern does not understand why he insists on following them too is, Northern heard a knock on the door and sighed, pulling himself to go open it, since he had locked it from inside because Ellis kept coming every 3 minutes before now. He opened the door and before him stood the +1. The extra, dark-haired, pale skin and a bland look plastered to his face. He wrinkled his nose in disgust as he looked at Northern, then fixed his face back to his usual bored face. "I don't understand. Don't you have a home to return to?" Ryan looked at Northern, his eyes were unchanging, almost looking frozen. "No, I don't." Northern sighed. "You could have gone with Annette though. She was going to the academy. I don't want to associate with new people." Northern looked at the boy and felt truly sad for him in his heart. He was supposed to be 18 or even more, and yet, Northern couldn't help but feel like he had just gained a younger brother. Chapter 485. Development. Northern and Ryan were in the room for a while. Silence easily reigned in the atmosphere and both of them seemed to have no problem with it. Northern was occupied with his thoughts while Ryan was just being Ryan. Northern had not just been laying around for the past 3 days since he opened his eyes. He had actually been training, of course, alone, to avoid casualties since he had no way of knowing how bad his punch would hit or the limit of his strength. But he was spending the time getting acclimated with the new talent abilities he had, the movements of his body, and most importantly his eyes. Sadly, he had lost 2 important talents: Eyes of the Intent and Speedwalk. Eyes of Intent had been integrated into Chaos Eyes and Speedwalk was absorbed by the void that reformed his body, causing his body to have super fast reflexes and movement. His basic stride alone was fast enough to catch up with fast movements during intense battle. And when he put more effort, he imagined the fight with the Emperor, how fast the man was, and Northern felt like he would be able to catch up now. For his cloning ability, which had been evolved to duplicate, he gained a new talent ability named Mirror Split, which allowed his clones to be able to copy the traits of him and his enemies, mimicking their techniques or powers for a short duration. Hence, the clones could not just replicate his and his enemies' abilities but could also adapt based on the situation. It was a great boost to the ability. And sadly, that was all he received. Out of the 3 own talents he had, 2 had become integrated into his body. Northern felt sad and happy at the same time, because there was evidence that they were effective. His movement was one thing, and his eyes? His eyes were on a whole nother level. But at the very least, now he had 4 own talents, one of which is the talent of a paragon that he had not even begun to scratch the surface of. But the highlight of his growth to a master was his body, his eyes, and the limitless void. First was his body. Northern had trained in the limitless void, alongside Black Mamba and Night Terror, who also had gone through changes of their own. Night Terror had become overwhelmingly powerful that he now had the insane ability to deliver invisible cuts without even moving his finger. But there were pros and cons to such ability. Northern still fell prey to it though. The first time it happened, he had taken serious damage, and while Chaos Thread was doing its work, he had noticed something about his own body. At first, he felt it was a wild thought, so the duel between the 3 of them continued. Night Terror's invisible cut could not be avoided. At least, right now, Northern didn't know how to avoid such a cut, and the sad part was that Danger Sense was not being triggered. Because it was a cut that isn't there until it is there. So, the minute time it'd take Danger Sense to trigger, it has been delivered. It was a crude and unfair ability given to an already crude and unfair existence. On the second hit, however, Northern did not take full damage. It didn't hurt as much as it did before, and the stitching up of his wounds was easier and faster. And on the third hit, Northern's body did not receive damage. Even the sentient being, Night Terror, was as shocked as he was. It was as if the cut was made on an impenetrable metallic surface, leaving a very small scratching that was smoking hot. When Northern was first initial to Night Terror's attack, he had first observed that his cells were analyzing the damage done to his body. He didn't want to think too wild about it. On the second hit, the damage was reduced by around 30 to 50%. He knew at that point that his body had developed a partial resistance to the ability. And in order to confirm, he decided to allow the third hit, which happened to not hurt at all. Northern now intentionally began to take Night Terror hits, and as time passed, the hit did not matter at all. It wasn't just Night Terror. He tried the same thing with Black Mamba. The initial hit was insane. It even took a bit longer for his body to develop full resistance, but it was the same thing as he had experienced with Night Terror's attack. And it was insane. Not to say that his body had some amazing new features, as he had observed and experimented in the past 1 week, even before he opened his eyes. When he had first come around, the weather was a bit overwhelming. He had great stamina and endurance for several conditions in his body already. That was including the severe cold. The cold of the border was unhealthy and unnatural. It was a phenomenon caused by something that no one has been able to discover yet. And when he first began to settle in after his evolution, it was difficult, but that was only for a few hours. He literally felt his muscles thicken to retain heat, and his skin before his very eyes developed a frost-resistant layer. He felt like this feature had also contributed to his body's ability to analyze and adapt to a certain threat. But that was not as impressive as finding out he could move the position of his organs around his body. It was insane. Inside his body felt like it was a formless fluid that he could just move around and adapt anyhow. Those were already amazing developments. And then his eyes. First, Northern's perception of the chaos had skyrocketed. Not only could he now perceive the instability, cracks, and weaknesses in reality itself, he could also see where physical laws begin to break down or where distortions in time, space, and matter manifest. This allowed him to exploit or manipulate chaotic energies and tear into the very fabric of reality, which was how he was able to in an instant find out what the humans of the Central Plains have not been able to discover for over thousands of years. The source of the intense cold. Of course, Northern kept his mouth shut anyway. It wasn't an imminent threat, and he felt it was a piece of information that was going to serve him a great price of trade later. Northern now sees the essence of living beings, from their souls to their deepest desires, fears, and traumas. He can sense the flow of soul energy, detect hidden auras, and observe how souls are tied to both the material and immaterial realms. And those were just its passive effects. Yes, Chaos Eyes now had active effects. Chapter 486. Departure. Reality warping. With the Chaos Eyes, Northern can now subtly alter aspects of reality. He might cause physical structures to destabilize by increasing entropy or temporarily altering local laws of physics. For example, he could weaken the ground beneath his enemies or bend light to obscure himself. Soul alteration. He can influence the souls of others directly. By focusing his gaze, Northern can disrupt the soul integrity of an opponent, weakening their resolve, destabilizing their energy, or even altering their emotions. He can also mend soul damage or disrupt harmful curses or hexes cast on others. Because of the Chaos Eyes, Northern had also developed the ability to merge chaos with soul energy, creating devastating effects. For instance, he could cause a person's soul to become entangled with chaotic forces, leading to internal disarray and soul disintegration. Alternatively, he could synchronize his own soul with chaotic elements, enhancing his power by embracing unpredictability and disorder. Although all this has yet to be put into real practice. But he knew for sure that it was possible and what he could do because these eyes exist. Chaos Eyes also allows Northern to perceive multiple dimensions of time and space. Although in limited flows, he can see brief flashes of the future and trace the past's influence on the present. However, Northern was more keen on this ability's effect in battle. This means he can anticipate an enemy's movements based on the flow of their soul energy and the disruptions in spacetime around them. He can also manipulate time and space on a small scale, momentarily slowing down time for a single target, or distorting space to create confusing or unpredictable environments. And just like he could create and alter void constructs after merging with the void, Northern can now create constructs of pure chaotic energy, but fueled by his understanding of soul dynamics. These constructs could be weapons or barriers designed to shatter not only physical objects but also the soul of those they touch. A chaotic blade created this way could sever the soul energy of an enemy, leaving them vulnerable to further attacks. There was much more he also felt he would discover by experimenting, but experiment was too costly for him, because of the insane abilities these eyes held. So he decided that he'd stick with what he knew inherently in his head for now. Unfortunately, as powerful as Chaos Eyes, they also had a fatal weakness on him. The increase in the chaotic aspect of the Chaos Eyes now means that Northern must always be careful with how much reality he distorts. If he overuses the ability, the chaos may begin to affect him, leading to unpredictable side effects, such as mental instability or physical degradation. Focusing too deeply on the souls of others can cause Northern's own soul to suffer from overexertion. If he overextends himself in manipulating the souls of others, his own soul might become unstable, leaving him vulnerable to soul attacks. The ability to see multiple layers of reality, time, and soul energy can be overwhelming. In moments of extreme duress or when too many chaotic forces converge, Northern might struggle to separate these layers and could risk getting lost in the chaos of overlapping realities. They were overwhelming weaknesses that informed that he needed to be careful with Chaos Eyes. And then the limitless void. Northern raised his head up as Shin opened the door. He stood up from his bed as he asked, "We are ready to go?" Ryan, who was leaning on the wall with his eyes closed, opened his eyes and stood uprightly. Shin looked at both of them before he could answer. Ellis, who was behind him, forced his way into the room the moment he saw Ryan. What are you doing here? Seriously? Can't you just go home?" Ryan looked disgusted and looked away. Ellis paused and smelt himself with a puzzled expression. When he saw that he wasn't particularly smelling in any way, he glared at Ryan the more, furiously rebuking him. "What the hell? Why are you making that kind of face? You are the odd one here. There's no way we are traveling with you. Just go home already." Hao walked in. Despite his shortness, he still managed to give Ellis a smack on the back of his head that caused the boy to stagger a few steps forward. Ellis groaned painfully. "Ow, wow. That hurts. We are not in the stronghold anymore." "Oh? So, yeah, aren't my student anymore." Hao had an evil grin on his small, mischievous face. Ellis dropped to a kowtow. Please forgive this young and foolish son of yours. Son? Don't delude. Yes, self, how looked away, stroking his mustache. Northern looked at both of them and couldn't have been more proud of his decision to let Ellis train to become a merchant from Hao. He observed Hao for a little more while and thought, he looks so much like a dwarf. While Northern made a casual statement like that in his mind, it was one that was born out of several things he had seen in that single moment, and Hao's height was the least of it. Northern finally looked at his father. Somehow the atmosphere had calmed enough for him to speak now. As Northern's gaze met him, Shin spoke. I have the necessary things to aid our journey to Drywall. I've managed to secure transportation going to Dermany's terminal. From the terminal, we will warp to Fugal, and from Fugal, it's an easy journey to South Drywall. We could even walk, and it'd take us barely 2 days. Northern nodded in acknowledgement and looked at Hao. He will be going with us to Dermany's terminal, but won't be warping to Fugal. Instead, he will be going to Shamanicles. Shin raised a brow. The trade city? It's really been dangerous there recently. Hao smiled proudly. Don't you worry about me, young man. Shin smiled and nodded. All right then. There's no problem. The Central Plains is an interesting place. They have warping portals in every kingdom capital. That makes transportation so easy, Hao thought after his response. Northern glanced at all of them for the last time. The one person he really had not expected to find here was Ryan. Except that, he was glad he had come this far with these people from the Dark Continent. Well then, I guess we are all ready to leave. Northern suddenly narrowed his eyes. Shin observed his sudden change in expression and asked almost immediately, what's wrong? Then behind him, the invisibility veil on reality began to tear and someone waved their hand in the air. As expected, even though I was being invisible, you still noticed me. Hi, I heard you guys are gonna Drywall. Can I tag along? Chapter 487. Fugal. Northern did not particularly perceive Reno as a special threat. They had met only once when he was to steal some sort of map from Helena, and his invisibility was a big deal. Northern thought for a while if he should copy the ability but decided against it. He didn't think he'd need a reason to be stealthy or invisible in the future. And should there be, he believed his control of the void and what his eyes could now allow him to do was more than enough. With everyone's consent, especially Shin's, Reno was allowed to join the team. They all trekked to the thick, gigantic tank caracal that was waiting for them in front of the building. The caracal was powered by 4 enormous bulwarks. Bulwarks were domesticated monsters with antenna-like horns, red beady eyes, and strong faces just like usual bulls. Their bodies were also like bulls but boasted more muscle lines, making them look incredibly strong. Their speed belied their size. They were the uncensored definition of brute strength and speed. An equal and undiluted blend of both elements distributed in these brawny monsters. While there was an air of modernity to the caracal, talking about the external plates and body, it was almost like the traditional chariot, supported by a pair of fat black tires to match the pace and strength of their core engine and hauler. The inside of the caracal seamlessly melded luxury with functionality, echoing the fusion of classic design and cutting-edge technology seen in its exterior. Upon entering, Northern was struck by the spacious cabin, far larger than what he expected thanks to the innovative design. The walls were lined with dark, polished wood, inlaid with gleaming metal accents that mirrored the external plating. These metal strips occasionally pulsed with a soft light, hinting at the advanced systems running throughout the vehicle. Plush seating dominated the space, upholstered in rich, deep red fabric that brought to mind the beady eyes of the bulwark beasts. The seats were generously proportioned and deeply cushioned to absorb the vibrations from the powerful creature's gait. A control panel sat at the front, its sleek design a stark contrast to the ornate wooden paneling. Here, holographic displays provided real-time information on the bulwark's vitals, speed, and navigational data. Despite the high-tech interface, traditional leather reins hung nearby, a nod to the timeless connection between driver and beast. The ceiling was particularly striking. A transparent dome allowed passengers to gaze up at the sky, but with a twist it could darken instantly for privacy or to display a map of the surrounding terrain. Storage compartments were seamlessly integrated into the walls, their handles disguised within the wooden patterns. When opened, they revealed climate-controlled spaces for refreshments or personal items. This was not a particularly surprising spectacle to anyone except Northern and Hao, who had never been in any of these before. Northern, in his expression, appreciated the design, while Hao was intriguingly inspecting with an "oh-oh" look on his face. Soon, the caracal got into action, plunging forward with the power of the bulwarks. Their powerful steps resonated with the entire functionality and vibration of the vehicle, but it did not tremble or discomfort its passengers in any way. From this time of the day's rise, till nightfall, where they had to stop at the closest aberdes to avoid traveling at night and rest a bit before getting to their destination, it was a smooth ride. And nothing out of the ordinary had happened. In fact, Northern had been wishing for something to happen. The moment they got to an aberdes, which almost looked like a ghost house, Northern had been expecting that some kind of criminals would barge in on them to steal their stuff. Then they'd perceive him to be the weakest and take a swing at him or something. But the aberdes was so peaceful and empty, with just a drunkard singing and playing his string musical instrument, apparently very nicely for a drunkard. But that was the reason Northern was not able to catch a very peaceful sleep throughout the night. At some point, Northern had even entertained the idea of killing him. Eventually, he managed somehow and fell asleep while thinking about the man's messed up way of singing. The next day, they woke up and got ready to go to Fugal. Northern did not know why, but he collected a couple of coins from Shin and gave them to the man with a smile on his face and a thank you. All he did was follow his instincts. The others were shocked and asked him why, but Northern did not respond. While he had a nudging feeling that he and the man would cross paths again, he didn't have all the information, so he didn't want to say. And thus, they began their journey to Fugal, which was just half a day's journey from their last checkpoint in a semi-wilderness. Fugal was a republic city that used to belong to the nation of Sierra. They had played a significant role in the making of history. And due to that, some personnel had spearheaded the city's decision to break out of the nation of Sierra. It was a pretty underhanded, dirty, and daring play of politics, but in the end, these leaders ended up being successful and ended up making Fugal an independent city, breaking away from the monarchy rule of the royal family of Sierra. Northern was not a politics guy before his world, certainly he wasn't right now, but growing up, he had no choice but to read a lot of newspapers. And a lot of those newspapers were how he connected dots of information regarding the nations of this world. Fugal reflected its bold and rebellious history in its architecture and overall appearance. The city was a blend of old-world charm from its time under Sierra's rule, with remnants of royal architecture, grand stone buildings, and elaborate squares. It also had a more pragmatic, industrious feel, marked by the growth of certain functional, rigid structures, symbolizing the independence and hard-earned freedom from monarchy. Tall, imposing towers dotted the skyline, representing the powerful institutions that now govern Fugal, adorned with the city's emblem, a symbol of defiance and unity. Streets were bustling, filled with merchants and workers, with traces of both old-world elegance and modern ambition. Central plazas, once designed for royal processions, were now filled with public gatherings, where debates were held and citizens discussed political matters openly, near statues of leaders who spearheaded the city's independence. Walls surrounding the city were heavily fortified, so Northern and the others had to wait a little while before they could pass by. It was particularly easy thanks to Shin's status as a protector. Under every circumstance, Fugal was a tightly secured city. Entry without an identity card was always difficult, but it also kept the city safe, well, as best as it could. They weren't particularly safe from themselves. Stone walls weathered from the past monarchy's influence contrasted with newer, fortified sections built after their freedom. The city's heart, an enormous council hall, was modern and polished, with large glass windows representing transparency in their government. Overall, Fugal was a city marked by contrasts. Old grandeur mingling with the symbols of newfound independence. Straight away, Northern and his cohort journeyed directly to the warp port. From the window, before they got to the port, Northern could see the spearhead of a pale green crystal piercing the sky, its lower part blocked by several buildings. Eventually, their vehicle stopped in front of a building, where two heavily suited soldiers stood with silver spears crossed over the gate. The driver exchanged a few words with Shin while Northern and the rest got down from the vehicle. The walls of the port were brownish bricked and were an out-of-pocket aesthetic that somehow contrasted the entire representation of the city in an odd way. It was insinuative of the fact that this place was most likely recently built. And it was the government's final act of accepting Fugal as an independent nation of their own, which most likely made them the smallest nation in the world, at least in the Central Plains. Well, that's just my thoughts. Who knows, there could be a smaller nation than this one. Shin finally got to where they stood and showed the guard his ID, explaining that he was traveling with all of them and they were all underage. Hao was a bit offended that the guard did not seem to argue with Shin about him. Perhaps it was an issue of height? But Northern encouraged him to look to the bright side of how it didn't work against them, so he decided to do just that, which proved to be more difficult than expected for him. All he wanted to do was just go back and smack some sense into the damn soldier. Immediately, they entered the compound of the port. They were approached by a slick-back, blonde-haired guide in a simple white shirt, black pants and black waistcoat, who showed them to the waiting room and collected information on where they all would be warping to and went away to submit it. Of course, they would tip him at the end of all of it. Guides had the simple job of just showing people to the waiting room, but some of them, as an extended means of hustling, would go as far as helping people further, speaking with their colleagues to put the list ahead of others. Of course, they must not get caught. They could get suspended for it. But they did it anyway. As money in this part of the city was not an easy thing to come by, they had to work so hard, and sometimes it wouldn't even be enough. That was just one of the downsides of Fugal on a lighter mode because it was also common in every other nation. However, far diluted compared to this place. Chapter 488. The Warp Gate, Part 1. The waiting room was filled with several other people, which made the air a mixture of different fragrances, transitioning from soft and tender to thick and choking. But there was nothing anyone could do about it. The place was an array of cushioned chairs with different people sitting. The portal officials would intermittently come around and call names. Northern, the moment he entered the lobby, had gained a total count of how many people were sitting in the room. He had managed to be able to suppress his void aura to the point where the chill just existed when one sat close to him. The pressure around him had also dropped, although slightly. A mundane human might notice nothing, but a drifter who is quite perceptive would know immediately, which Northern didn't like. Hopefully, with more practice, he'd be able to suppress it really hard or turn it into something else that is not a mood of intense power and depression around him. A few minutes after Northern had settled down, he was able to tell how strong everyone in the room was, and who were impressive enough to deserve his attention. And out of all of them, only two made him curious. The fascinating part was that he seemed to fascinate them as much as they fascinated him, because they wouldn't stop looking at him. Even though he wasn't looking at them, the way their gaze confidently rested on him over time. Northern somehow knew they wanted to gauge their strength by looking directly into his eyes, which before now had been closed, while he waited for their turn. The two of them were seated on the couch opposite his, but slightly adjacent to the direction he sat. They were opposite sexes but looked exactly the same. The girl had an intense and striking appearance. She had dark skin with glowing purple eyes that gave off a powerful, almost mystical aura. Her hairstyle was bold, featuring two large, puffy buns on either side of her head, with tight, intricate braids leading into the buns. Her expression was serious, exuding confidence and a touch of defiance. The boy was calm and confident. His skin was dark as well, and his striking purple eyes mirrored an intensity that also reflected in his calm expression. A small smile curled on his lips. His hair was styled in short, thick twists that were neatly arranged, adding to his sharp, well-groomed appearance. He had a few subtle lines shaved into the sides of his head and a dangling silver earring, enhancing his modern, stylish look. Both of them had their hands folded, but the girl sat a little crudely. Beside her was a large black box. She crossed her legs, allowing most of her thighs below her skimpy flare skirt to be displayed. Northern liked the confidence they exuded. It made him curious as to who they were, but he was not going to give them what they wanted because of it. It served him no purpose to make two younglings who have no idea what lies in front of them pee their pants. While he did accolade their level of strength, he considered them reckless still. He'd roast them with his look alone. A while later, a male official came and called, "Soraya and Kaelin Valketh." Immediately, the girl and the boy stood up. The girl took the long box and strapped the handle to her shoulders, her short skirt swaying left and right as she walked away. The boy also followed with his hands in his pockets and his usual accommodating smile, even after stealing a glance at Northern before he eventually left. The smile was ever stagnant. "Oh, they have like Vita's skin," Ellis murmured as he watched them go. Everyone in the cohort that saw them also had the same thought. But they were silent about it until they both had left. Took another while, then Hao was called separately. He stood up and bade Northern and his father farewell, looked at Ellis and gave him a knock on the head, asking him to behave and remember all he'd been taught, before leaving with the official. The portal was always functioning round the clock. However, there were certain hourly breaks every now and then to give the gate and crystal a rest period. The crystal itself had been cultivated from rifts, although the history of these rifts dates back to the first and only Tier X rift to ever appear. There was no accountable history, or better still, Northern had not come across one to accurately say for sure what happened with the appearance of this rift. But he knew that the population of the world greatly reduced. It was also the major cause of the continental division, well, except for Starlock, which used to be a part of Central Plains all along. After a while, Northern and his crew were eventually called towards midnight. Then they proceeded to the warp gate. It was a small open space gate beneath the crystal. The crystal served as the connector source. It was the main reason why they could teleport to another point. The gate, as it meant, was a passageway to the reception point of teleportation. The crystal kept the connection online, hence making it possible for the gate to warp them to another receptor gate. Of course, several crystal tech advancements had gone into this project, further evolving the navigations and receptor-to-receptor accuracy. The female official who had switched since the recent break was overbriefed them on things to do as they marched to the gateway. Any electrical source around your body can inhibit the teleportation, so it's advisable to leave such material at the storage point. It will be transported manually to the location you desire. Also, it is advisable to cease any soul essence activity, as this can trigger malfunctions and misdirection. They got to the step that led to the gateway. Then the whole crew nodded in acceptance as the official lady finished talking. Northern looked at the gigantic crystal from below, subtly narrowing his deep gaze as he examined the phenomenal material. A Tier X rift has to be a different kind of hell. I feel hell would be an understatement, in fact, he thought as he averted his gaze and walked to the gateway. Chapter 489. The Warp Gate, Part 2. Northern and his crew were required to stand at the center of the gate. A golden pillar that arched over them, with a piece of the same crystal in the center of the arc. They waited a little bit for the whole mechanism to start. Northern could hear a soft whirring sound that slowly built up, but all of a sudden there was a crack in the build-up. Then it slowly dropped. At that point, Northern figured, "Oh damn, there's a problem," and he feared that the source of that problem would most likely be him. A couple of seconds later, the whirring sound started building up again. Then the same thing happened. There was a crack and the build-up began to drop. The official approached them, politely saying, "We would like to test the functionality of the gateway on other travelers to figure out if the problem is with the travelers or the gateways." Her tone was pleasing to listen to. The level of humility in her tone would make anyone be very calm and sensible with her. "Does this happen usually?" Shin inquired, looking at her inquisitively. "It's not uncommon to experience faults in the gateway every now and then, but the problem is that the gateway seems to be experiencing some kind of overload. This usually happens when the gateway is trying to transfer a large number of souls." Shin folded his arms with a serious look at the lady. "And how many is a large number?" 1,000. Shin went silent for a second, then retorted, "Okay, there's definitely a problem. It's fine, you can check. There'll be no need for that." Shin looked at his son, raising a brow. Northern continued, I kind of know the reason why that is happening. He looked specifically at the lady and asked, "Do you guys have one for a larger capacity?" The lady hesitated for a moment with skepticism playing on her face before she responded. "Yes, sir. There definitely is a larger capacity gateway. However, it is used for military purposes or for extremely important travelers such as paragons and ascendants." Northern nodded his head. "I understand. How much do I have to pay to use the other one?" The lady hesitated again, this time looking at Northern from head to toe. He was wearing a casual shirt alongside black pants and knee-level boots, which he received from the border. She politely said to him, "Sir, it will cost a lot of money." "How much?" 3,000 credis. 3,000 credis, that is 300,000 talii. Northern juggled his memory. The commonly accepted currencies in the Central Plains were talis, plural, talii, which was the base currency of the world, small bronze coins, used for day-to-day transactions. Credi, plural, credis, mid-tier currency which is made of silver representing higher status or wealth. Orens, plural, orens. These are gold coins, which are used for high market transactions and can be found amidst several merchants. Cryst, plural, crysts. These are modernized paper money backed by a combination of precious materials and some form of magical essence. 1 credi equals 100 talii. 1 orens equals 50 credis or 5,000 talii. 1 cryst equals 100 orens or 5,000 credis or 500,000 talii. Hence the reason why 3,000 credis was 300,000 talii, which is quite a lot of money. Enough for a peasant to buy a house, a farm, and start a family, feeding them for at least a year. A middle-class house costs 1,000 credis, which is an estate with a 5-room mansion and a nice garden compound. So yes, it was pretty expensive. Northern sighed. He was in a lot of trouble now. Shin looked at him, worried. He still could not comprehend why Northern was asking to use a much larger one. But he didn't question what Northern was doing. By now, he had figured out that there were tons of things he didn't know about his son, including the tremendous strength he was hiding. "We have a total of 396,000 talii, so it's still affordable," Shin said with a calm voice. The lady exchanged her eyes between the two of them, looking at them like they were insane. "I'm sorry, but shouldn't that money serve you a better purpose? I'm sure it's just a slight malfunction. It will work as soon as it's tested with the next batch of travelers." Northern shook his head and directed his gaze at her. "Test it as much as you want. You'd still keep having the same issue." The lady had an extremely confused look on her face. She was trying to be very considerate and reasonable, but it seemed these peasants weren't having it. Then a thought broke into her mind, making her eyes widen. Her mouth opened as she realized what she could be missing. "I'm very sorry for not recognizing a paragon." "Eh?" Not only Northern, but all the crew exclaimed. "Paragon? Where?" "I'm sorry. There seems to be a mistake. None of us here is a paragon." Shin cleared the air. Immediately, the girl stood back with a puzzled frown. "Then an ascendant?" she inquired. Shin looked at the rest. They all shook their heads. Then he responded, "No." The lady looked at Northern. "I'm sorry, sir. Is it okay for me to ask what rank you are?" Northern indifferently answered, "I am a master." "How old, sir?" 16. 16 and a master? That's insanely impossible. The thought caused her eyes to widen. She was meaning to confirm what rank he is, for him to speak like he was 1,000 souls walking in one body. But she had ended up being taken by shock that she forgot her initial reason. A 16-year-old master in the Central Plains has never been heard of. "Please, can we proceed?" Northern bothered. The lady broke out of her shock. At this point, she was just mentally tired. She shrugged. "If it's what you want, then there is no problem." Shin brought out the pack of coins, selected 96 coins from it and handed the rest to the lady. The lady bowed as she received and took one last glance at Northern, who was expressionless. She faced Shin and the rest of the crew. Then you all can proceed to the center of the gateway. Shin and the rest of them did as she said, while she walked away with Northern. After a while, the whirring began its build-up again. This time, however, there was no drop. The build-up continued till the crystal in the center arc began to glow brightly. Eventually, a formula circle on the ground appeared with a blue glow as the crystal. Then a light enveloped them, instantly warping them to South Drywall. Chapter 490. Sleep and Tight. The second gateway was much grander than the initial one, also wider, gleaming with an almost whitish sheen, both the pole and the arc. The lady stopped at the beginning of the black metallic steps and signaled with her hand for Northern to continue up, keeping as straight a face as she could manage. Northern did as she instructed, walking to the center of the gateway and sincerely hoping that there was going to be no issue this time around. The reason for the malfunction was very simple. The gateway counted the quantity of souls and transported them, and in some cases the quality of souls. If Northern were to be literal, his soul was a very robust world that now held within it thousands of souls. If this object was as potent as its reputation suggested, then that meant it wasn't counting Northern as just one soul, but rather as thousands of souls. This was due to all the souls in the limitless void. That was what made the malfunction surprise Northern. He was truly awed at the ability of the gateway and the crystal, and that made him realize that the Central Plains was a place he had not truly ventured into, even though he grew up there. He had heard of several things through the news feed and the mouths of travelers, but he had never actually been there. The thought of finally starting his adventure journey in the Central Plains made his heart leap with a small force of excitement, and Northern actually looked forward to it. Northern stood in the center of the gateway while the whirring sound built up again. This time, he tried to guess where the mechanism was positioned. There was no point he could think of, except below the metallic platform he was standing on. I'm guessing all of it is part of the gateway, he thought. Northern looked down the moment a white circle appeared on the ground, then began to grow brighter. At some point, the circle looked like it was blinking, which had Northern worried, but eventually, a white light purged out of it, enveloping him, and slowly his point of view changed. What Northern saw, though it was brief, was a blank white world with flowing flame-like threads. It was the same thing as the ligatures of reality he was used to observing. The only difference was this blank white world. Then Northern's perspective became that of another gateway. He looked up at the dark sky of midnight and sighed. Was that subspace? They created a subspace, he thought. There were several more questions flowing in his head, prompting him to want to study the whole history surrounding the warp crystal and the gateway engineering. Anything that had to do with reality, space, time, and gravity concerned him very much because those were laws that could greatly hinder the void and chaos of his ability. How exactly did he know? The more the void grew in him, the more its memories became his memories. The only sad part was that Northern was also aware he was losing his sense of self. At the very least, right now, it wasn't so obvious. As he stepped down from the platform, a male attendant approached him. I'm here with the crew led by a tall, black-haired, scarred-faced man. His description of Shin was crude, but the attendant immediately recognized who he was talking about and said, "Please follow me." As Shin and the rest arrived, they were immediately escorted to the waiting room, where Northern was taken. The place, in terms of grandiosity, was on the same level as Fugal, but the themes were different. The chairs were blue and shiny and were not arranged in lines opposite each other. Instead, each three-seater cushion was placed in a center, with a glass table in the middle. However, the difference between this place and Fugal was that the moment Northern entered the room, more than 5 people turned their heads with wary expressions on their faces. Their gaze was strictly on the white-haired figure who casually walked toward a seating area. The moment Shin saw him, he, along with the rest of them, stood up and slowly began to leave the waiting room. As they left, Northern asked Shin, "Aren't you going to ask me what is wrong with me?" Shin was silent for a few seconds after the question. Then he said, "If there's one thing I know, it's that now you have a lot of secrets. Your gaze is so deep that sometimes, looking at it makes me feel like I am falling into a dark depth with no end. You are unreadable at times. I have no idea what is going on in your mind, and you barely even smile. That last part. I don't remember smiling much while growing up, Northern replied. Shin chuckled. You smiled every time Aisha held you. I'm sure you'll find your smile again. Northern's expression became somewhat despondent. Don't be so sure. After a few moments, as they trekked out of the port, Northern asked again. So what do we do from here? Shin looked at the others who were behind them before bringing his eyes back to Northern. We find a lodge. After you. Shin smiled a little and led them away. The streets of South Drywall, even at midnight, bubbled with a small crowd of people. But Northern's guess was that they couldn't be the good kind of people. They were probably the sort who caused crimes under the cover of darkness. Even their gazes were full of suspicion. Of course, there were still innocent people, such as other travelers and merchants conducting legitimate business. Soft light illuminated the walkway of the street. There were dark alleys here and there, from which unpleasant smells and moans emerged, and dirt littered the ground. Eventually, Shin stopped in front of an auberge. The signboard with a blinking neon light read, "Sleepin' Tight." Shin looked at it with a smile. Quite the name, isn't it? Chapter 491. The Coming Nightmare. Sleepin' Tight glowed with a warm, inviting charm, thanks to the lanterns hanging on its exterior. These cast a soft, golden hue across the cobbled street in front, creating a cozy, intimate atmosphere. The flower boxes on the windows, filled with vibrant flowers, were dimly illuminated, their colors muted in the night, but still adding a touch of life to the building's old-world charm. The roof reflected a soft glow, with the timber and white walls appearing quaint yet sturdy in the dim light. As Northern and everyone stepped inside, they were greeted by lobby with a blend of rustic elegance. The wooden beams overhead gave the space a homely feel, complemented by rich, dark oak flooring. To the left, a hearth crackle with a fire that filled the room with warmth, the shadows of the flames dancing across the walls. A few people sat in cushioned chairs, their weary faces lit by the ambient glow of low-hanging lamps. The front desk was situated along the right side of the lobby, made of polished wood, with a tall stack of ledgers and a bell for guests to ring. The auberge's keeper, a stout, friendly-looking figure, smiled as they entered. There couldn't have been a better time for you to come, he said with an even friendlier smile. His entire demeanor was utterly appealing. Shin approached his table and looked back at everyone. We would like 3 rooms. There are different grades. We have the Rascals grade, quite cheap but it's underground. Then we have the Commoners grade, which goes for 50 talii per night for 1 room. The Middleman grade goes for 200 talii per night, and the Nobleman grade goes for 500 talii per night. We will take the Commoners grade, for 50 talii. The man nodded and put his hand below the drawer of his desk, after which he brought out a bunch of keys. Shin did not bring out the pouch of coins. Instead, he dipped his hand into his clothes where they were kept and ruffled for some seconds before bringing out 150 talii and dropping it on the table. Northern observed him from behind and looked back at the few people sitting in the lobby. He could tell his father knew what he was doing. The innkeeper swiped it off the table and said to them with an insidious smile at Shin, "Follow me." He led them to the far side of the lobby, where a grand staircase led upward. It was wide, with a deep mahogany finish, the handrail smooth and slightly worn from years of use. Each step creaked softly underfoot as they ascended toward their rooms. The walls beside the stairs were adorned with faded portraits and tapestries, adding a sense of history to the space. The smell of baked bread and warm soup drifted in from a side door, suggesting that the auberge's dining area was still active, with patrons enjoying late-night meals before retiring for the night. As they got upstairs, the atmosphere of the auberge became quieter, almost serene. The hallways were lined with a plush, deep red carpet that muffled footsteps, adding to the sense of calm. Soft, golden lanterns affixed to the walls illuminated the corridor, casting a gentle glow that made the space feel intimate and welcoming. The wooden beams of the ceiling continued from downstairs, though here they felt lower, cozier, giving the upstairs a more private, secluded feel. The doors to the rooms were made of sturdy oak, with brass handles that glinted faintly in the low light. Each door was numbered in a neat, embossed script. The man stopped in front of one door and looked at the crowd with an expecting gaze. Naturally, Northern stepped forward, and so did Ellis right after him, after he noticed Ryan looked like he wanted to move. The keeper gave Northern the key to the room, which had the same numbering as the room did. Then he led others away. As Northern and Ellis stepped into their room, what met them was a modest and comfortable space. The wooden floor was softened by a small woven rug, and a simple but well-crafted bed stood against one wall, with thick blankets and pillows invitingly arranged. The room was furnished with a small writing desk positioned near a window, offering a view of the quiet street below. The window had heavy curtains, deep green, which were left open to let in the soft glow from the street lanterns outside. A small fireplace sat in the corner, crackling softly, offering warmth to the room. Above it, a mantel with a few modest trinkets or a simple mirror hung. A wooden wardrobe stood opposite the bed, with enough space for their belongings. However, none of them had belongings. Beside the bed, a nightstand with a small oil lamp provided light, casting shadows across the room's wood-paneled walls. The air smelled faintly of aged wood and lavender, likely from sachets hung by the windowsill. The space was quiet, with only the occasional creak from the beams above or the faint murmur of voices from downstairs, creating a sense of peace. Ellis slumped to a sitting position on the bed, leaning on his hand. "It's a good one. So, would we be sleeping on the same bed?" Northern looked at him, his face contorting in disgust. Then he averted his eyes without saying anything. He walked closer to the window and looked out of it, staring outside for a while. Ellis, concerned, tried to look too and make out what Northern was looking at, but couldn't see anything out of the ordinary and worth looking at on the streets. However, the compact view of the roofs as they spread to the horizon was a capturing scenery to focus on. It made him realize how much he had missed the feel of being amongst civilization and people. Ellis's lips curled into a bitter smile as he said, "We indeed have come a long way, haven't we?" Northern, after a few beats, glanced at Ellis indifferently before responding. "Indeed we have, and we are about to start another long journey. This time, a nightmare far more wretched and cursed than anything we have ever been through." Chapter 492. The Growth of the Limitless Void. Northern's words settled into his mind like a storm. Even after Northern had slept on the ground and he was on the bed, he was finding sleep so hard to fall into just because of those words that Northern had uttered. Images of their humble beginnings played in his head. How Northern had stuck to him and helped him even when he had no reason to. Inasmuch as Northern portrayed himself to only be helping him because he needed his help in return, he wanted to believe that Northern helped him truly out of the goodness of his heart. And from then, he had owed Northern heavily. He thought about how weird Northern was, the trouble they got in, and how he handled it. He thought about the fight with the monster in the mansion. What he had seen that night made him understand for the first time that Northern's entire strength didn't rely on the fact that he had monsters he could summon. And from then, his respect and awe for Northern had only kept growing. However, with this growth, Ellis felt farther and farther away from him. With a somber look on his face, Ellis stretched his hand up, as if he wanted to grab the roof. Then he clenched it in the air. "This time, the journey will not be yours alone. And you won't be alone," he vowed. But at the same time, he feared for himself. Would he be able to work at Northern's pace? Would he even be worthy enough to dare? Those fears and thoughts strained his mind and eventually tired him to sleep. A while after Ellis had fallen into the embrace of a sound sleep, with subtle snow driving to and fro his lungs, Northern stood up and crossed his legs. Then he dove into the limitless void. First of all, the towering columns now seemed to stretch further than before, toward the heavens. Each one was now vividly etched with intricate symbols and glowing faintly with an ancient, mysterious energy. Their bluish hues contrasted sharply with the deep shadows they cast, faintly illuminating the vastness of the hall. Above, a delicate cascade of light streamed down from translucent ceilings far overhead, where waterfalls of shimmering liquid light poured from unseen heights, casting everything in a serene blue glow. The usually dark and ominous pathway, now flanked by well-tended trees, exuded tranquility, with soft foliage brushing against the warm golden lamps that lined the way. The air felt crisp and more realistic, tinged with a sense of calm and reverence, as if this place was a meeting point between nature and the divine. Everything about it spoke of ancient grandeur, a civilization that cherished both beauty and mystery. Northern had seen this before the first time he entered the limitless void, and even seeing it again now, he still could not erase the amazement that had been left on his face the first time he entered. The flames of chaos that burned at the edges of the steps that led to his whitish throne seat now burned larger, blocking the view to the absurdly tall whitish throne seat which stood imposingly behind the flames, its towering backrest gleaming with a soft white hue as the light caught the polished surface. Flanked by walls of tangible darkness, it gave the impression of a dark and effortless grandeur. The seat itself was elevated, its base wide and solid, as though carved from a single stone slab. Northern looked around his grand palace with astonishment in his eyes. "This feels like it deserves a place in the heavens or something," he muttered. Along with this astounding change, the Void Palace had also grown extensively, gained several rooms, and even a magnifying exterior, carved to be the highest viewpoint in the limitless void. From anywhere in the vast soulscape, his palace could be seen. Northern looked down, simultaneously summoning the panel to easily inspect the rest of the change. The limitless void has stretched further, becoming a more infinite and multidimensional space. Its vastness represents your growing understanding and mastery of the void, with its edges blending into unknown territories. Any more attraction could attract more powerful and ancient souls, or even elements of the Echo Realm. Why does this feel like a warning? And what is the Echo Realm? The system didn't look like it was ready to respond, and before now, Northern had never heard of such a word. However, it bothered him somehow. Could it be the underworld? He lingered before shaking his head. "No, I don't think so." Having no answer for now, Northern put the matter to rest in the backyard of his thoughts and continued his inspection. The souls of the monsters residing within the limitless void can now evolve. Instead of remaining as soul summons until you evolve them to void summons, they can now grow stronger, becoming spectras, an echo of their former self before evolving to become void summons themselves. Northern's mouth fell. What? This was everything he had ever wished for, and it was waiting for him when he became a master? Soul summons did not have a material body, which made it impossible for them to become void summons, because void summons were the materialization of a soul by void. It was not possible unless they had some sort of material body to be materialized by the void. His alternative was his clone. But the terms after advanced cloning became duplicate had been hard to come by. Singularity was difficult because it meant investing his talent fragments and then losing all of it the moment the talent devolved. With his need for talent fragments, he was very skeptical of going that route. Hence, he had just been stuck. Now, that has been rid of because soul summons can become a spectra where they gain an echo body of themselves before eventually becoming void summons. Northern was happy. He wouldn't be needing to weave the essence of void, mixing it with a clone and soul for a desired result anymore. Now, he could really just watch them all grow. This feels so rewarding. But he also didn't think the road to becoming a void summon would be something easy. But it was massive progress. Soul Forge. As a master, you can now use the souls of defeated monsters to forge powerful constructs or weapons within the void. These constructs could act as guardians or manifestations of your will, defending the limitless void or assisting you in combat. This process could lead to the creation of sentient weapons that you wield, with each one tied to the essence of a particular monster you have vanquished. Chapter 493, Revant Awakening. Northern stood for a few seconds, his mind blank. What he had just witnessed went against all common sense, or at least the boundaries of what was defined as common sense in this world. He could use souls to create weapons? Items? I thought items could only be gained upon kills. If I can create them, then what exactly does this insinuate? So many questions tumbled through Northern's mind, tiring him out in that moment. He was happy, overwhelmed by joy, in fact. But at the same time he was wary and inquisitive. This caused his suspicions of Ull to rise once again. And he couldn't help but wonder, is everything that has always been so far in Ultrael really as it seems? Even now, there was no certain answer, but the appearance of this unique ability had given him the right to question it. And as long as a question exists, one day, there will definitely come an answer. I will find it. Northern's eyes gleamed with determination. He refocused on his new ability. He really could create weapons with the souls of monsters. Soul Forge, he muttered. It was the last of the abilities he had received as a result of the progress of his soul, and it was very satisfying to him, especially Soul Forge. Northern sat on the ground of the palace. With the new view, it felt more lively and homely than before. Then he summoned the Night Terror, who appeared before him, bowing. Night Terror had no physical change, but the monster's eyes gleamed with intelligence, a precise and certain kind of intelligence, unlike anything that had been there before. "Bring the new guy," Northern commanded casually, but Night Terror instantly understood. He stood up and walked away, passing between the pillars, and after a few moments, returned hauling a coffin with large shackles draped over his shoulder. Northern tried not to mind the screeching of the coffin on the glass-like ground as Night Terror dragged it to his front. The monster halted, bowed, and stepped back. Northern then looked at the coffin. The soul of a tyrant. Thinking about it again, joy overwhelmed his heart. He was not walking down the path of a tyrant, obviously. He had the seed of an origin. Northern entertained the thought that one day he might end up being an origin, or at most a mixture of the two. However, he always questioned the possibility of these things because he believed that while tyranny could be attained, origins were born as origins. They were regarded as the beginning of a certain concept, so it made no sense for it to start with a seed. However, he also thought, maybe I am the first origin of Void. I couldn't really be considered an origin until I became one, which meant the point where the seed probably germinates and spreads is the true beginning. But what would make him different wasn't just that he would become an origin, it was that he would have a tyrant as a void summon, a servant. The thought alone filled him with a surge of pride. Finally, he shifted his focus from that idea and poured all 1,000 talent fragments he had gained from the unused talent slot into the link. And a link has been established. Northern looked down at the being as the system announced it. Immediately, a flood of sensations surged into his mind. His eyes widened, and he almost lost his balance, quickly stabilizing himself by leaning on the coffin. The connection was vivid and clear. He could feel it deeply, as though he had entered the mind of the tyrant, and the tyrant had entered his mind at the same time. "You have gained a unique ability. Mind's Eye." Immediately, Northern's forehead split open, revealing a pitch-black scara and a pure white pupil that swayed from side to side. As it did so on Northern's forehead, it did the same on the tyrant's, as the tyrant slowly opened his eyes. The vertical eye on his forehead closed and disappeared, as if it had never been there, just as it vanished from Northern's forehead. "What is this?" Northern quickly touched his forehead, realizing the eye was gone. "It felt like someone was seeing directly into and through my mind." At first, Northern thought he had tried to see with his own eyes but couldn't, then forced himself to create an eye in his mind, thus granting him the Mind's Eye. It only took that single moment for Northern to realize how powerful this creature could be. The tyrant rested his hand on the coffin lid and slowly pushed himself up, levitating out of the coffin, with dark smoke flowing over his lower body. Northern turned as he watched him land opposite him, observing as he looked around the Void Palace for a while before their eyes finally met. Then the tyrant's voice rang out. "This is incredible," he said, looking around and admiring the scenery. Northern was taken aback, his eyes slightly widening. The voice of the creature before him sounded exactly like his own, hoarse and rough, like a weathered surface. Not only that, but save for the unique eyes, the dark lines beneath his lip, the extremely pale skin, and white eyes, this creature looked exactly like him. He was like a warm Northern with black hair. "I don't know whether to call this a good thing," The creature was obviously going to be insanely powerful, but would he be as controllable as Northern wished and hoped? At this point, the last thing I need is a servant whose disobedience will mess up my plans. That's why Northern knew in that moment that there was no better time to establish his place than now. He might be a tyrant, but he is linked to me, lives because of me, and can die if I will it so. With that thought, Northern summoned confidence, which reflected in his dark eyes. His gaze became imposing, falling on the tyrant like a blanket of moonless darkness, causing the tyrant to suddenly grow cold. He involuntarily lowered his gaze as Northern's chin rose. Then Northern took purposeful strides toward the creature, stopping in front of him and saying, "Here are a few things to engrave in your core, Revant. I am your god, your creator, your master, and the only one you owe obedience, loyalty, and your life to." Chapter 494. A Burden Worth Bearing. Northern observed Revant for a few seconds after speaking. The tender-looking tyrant for a moment had a line of defiance laced upon his brows. Then he breathed, closing his eyes for a moment and opening them before saying, "Yes, I understand from the first moment I opened my eyes. You didn't need to get all defensive. But then, I understand that you—" He looked at his hands as he continued. "Even though I don't know so much about myself right now, I immediately know that I am a preeminent being. One whose power is imperious enough for you to feel fear." He paused, bringing his face to Northern and staring with an almost blank expression, only a small smile lacing his lips. After which he resumed, "I owe my life to you, my loyalty and obedience. I have peered into your head and determined that you have what it takes to be my master. For now." Northern frowned at the last two words. "What does that imply?" he inquired, disturbed. "It means that should I attain a point where I can break free from you, I won't hesitate to do so, except if even by then you are worth serving." Northern curled a corner of his lips and let loose a smidge of a scoff. "Then should I just get rid of you now? That will mean you are scared of standing up to the challenge to be better. I do not threaten you. Right now, you are quite an astounding existence for a human. But in the end, you are only human. Should I have the power to not serve you, a human, I will not serve you. And if I'm a human far stronger than you could ever be by then?" A small smile adorned Revant's face. "Now, that's the enthusiasm I seek. I have seen your life in your old world and this new one, and I am sure that there are many unanswered mysteries surrounding your existence. Puts me on my toes. If you are able to meet my expectations and are worth serving, then I will shamelessly serve you regardless of my status in the future." Northern clicked his tongue distastefully, an irritated expression climbing his face. "You seem to be mistaken about this. I am the one with the expectations here, and right now, I can't help but feel like you are an unnecessary burden. Perhaps I should just return you to nothing, just a ball of soul that you were." The tender tyrant was silent for a few seconds. Northern's words seemed to have gotten to him and truly made him realize that he really was not in the position to bargain. Moreover, Northern's eyes as he spoke were evident enough to tell him that Northern was actually going to destroy his body. Northern was very serious as well. Revant stood there slightly shaken by the reality that he might go back to being nothing when he just gained life. A few seconds later, he lowered one leg and dropped down, bowing his head. "I apologize for my temerity." Northern observed his demeanor for a while. It seems he is humble enough to realize that his pride means nothing right now and could cause destruction for him. However, it does not change what he said earlier. "I don't know if I need a servant who will be watching if I am worth serving or not. I might as well destroy him and use his soul for myself thanks to the new abilities I've gotten. But he's a tyrant." He sighed. Like it or not, Revant was a damned precious soul. An existence that will place him on a different stratum than every single existence in this world. Because never had it been heard that a tyrant served a human. If he could get Revant fully for himself. Northern brushed the excitement away. "I know that bastard has some kind of limited access to my mind. Let's not get him ahead of himself." Northern finally laid his gaze on the tender-looking tyrant and sighed again. Then suddenly he went blank, paying attention to something. However, it was not within the limitless void. It was outside. A ghastly smile left his face. Then he said, "I want to know your worth. That will make me decide whether to bear the unnecessary burden of keeping you." Revant raised his face up to Northern. It was difficult to tell what he was thinking. His blue eyes were almost non-existent, reflecting nothing, showing no emotions. But his tone was utterly submissive. Northern did not like it, but he had no choice for now. He just had to decide that this is the one burden that he needed to carry, and it was pretty worth it. He was a tyrant after all. "I will indecently vanquish all your foes." Northern looked at him blankly. "You have not gained enough respect from me to do that much. It seems some riffraff are about to be a bother. Deal with them." Northern hid a small wicked smile. Every word, every act towards the tender tyrant was intentional. He watched Revant disappear into the embrace of the dark flames before also disappearing. A group of dark-clothed individuals landed on the ceiling of the auberges. They moved with so much stealthiness that the slate roof made no creaks as they moved on it. More of them landed on the roof and slid down the wall of the building, with a refined and practiced finesse. All of them, amounting to almost 12, suddenly stopped as a black flame ignited on the roof and slowly died down, to reveal a young man in a black suit. His suit was unconventional, something they had never seen. It had silver embroideries. His black hair was subtly fluttering in the midnight wind, and his blue eyes glared down at them with intense disgust. He opened his hands. A blue flame began to flow out of it, forming a rose flower and gaining a refined shape that looked less like a flame, almost like the flame had gained physical form. He raised the blue flower to his face, holding it by the stem. Then he blew it. Scram! Chapter 495, Despair. The blue flower broke into petals and fluttered away from his hands. Each one of the petals miraculously managed to reach the front of the strangers who were all in different positions. They all froze in place, whether it was involuntary or voluntary even they did not know. But what they did know at that moment was that what stood above them felt like an impenetrable wall, as large as the sky beyond, imposing and bloodthirsty, filling their hearts with palpable despair. "We will die here." Those 4 words resurfaced a fear that they thought they had fought all their lives. And insidiously, the man that stood before them exuded such an ominous and intimidating presence that made them feel hopelessness. Each of them in their position was overwhelmed by a sense of futility and the belief that this marked the end of their lives, and that made their skin crawl with paralyzing fear. And as the petals fell on their heads, each of them began to pulp like fireworks bursting from their abdomen. The wall and roof of the auberges was a pastel work of red, green, and blue. Instantly, all their presence was gone. Not even flesh could be noted of them. Come morning, passers-by would think an insane artist had come to vandalize the walls of the auberges. Then a second later, one more dropped from the sky, sluggishly, looking left and right with widened eyes. His black masking was covering other parts of his face, but his eyes were enough to tell the shock he received upon looking around. Even he perhaps did not know what happened. He slid down on the wall as he had landed on the edge of the roof, about to break into one of the windows but suddenly froze. Behind him, impossibly standing on the wall, the dark-haired, enchanting man looked at him with an interesting smile. "What a stray you are," Revant said with a silly tone. He tapped the back of the intruder once, using his index finger, saying, "There you go." Right away, the intruder felt something change within his body. Even he did not know. He couldn't move, nor could he feel anything. His entire body and senses felt numb. All he could do was see, but what he was seeing was not even registering as any sort of information in his head. In a way, he had suddenly become a living puppet. Do you know despair is foundational to sensibility and is the balance between emotional states and the broader spectrum of human perception? He closed his eyes, savored the taste of the man's despair. Sweet. I wonder how I didn't know I could do this until now. I feel rejuvenated. like something is coming back to me. A lively light suddenly entered his eyes, making his face all glitter in the joy of realization. If I could eat the despair of so many more people, I could be able to recover my prime much faster than I thought. He looked at the pastry of colors he had made on the wall. What a waste they were. Then he sighed. What a waste everything is. This insolent human I have as a master. He suddenly went silent as he felt a hand rest on his shoulder, gripping him. Northern was standing behind him on the wall with his eyes tightly shut and a forced smile hiding the terror behind his face. Even so, the insidious terror still managed to leak. What did you say again? Revant went pale. I didn't see him at all. Suddenly, he just heard a shrill block his entire senses. His body went cold, and a suffocating fear crawled over his skin. The air grew heavy, as if the entire area had been submerged beneath an invisible ocean. Shadows deepened unnaturally, and a chill that pierced deeper than bones settled across the area. The atmosphere grew oppressive afterwards, smothering every sound until even the wind seemed to be silenced. Revant felt his heart race, his throat tightening in primal terror. It was as if an unseen hand had gripped his soul, draining warmth and hope from his very being. His body trembled involuntarily, sweat beading on his skin despite the cold. His mind struggling to comprehend the sudden and all-consuming presence of nothingness. Time itself seemed to distort under the weight of a significant release of Northern's void aura. Colors dulled, distances stretched, and the world felt distant and fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. His instincts screamed at him to flee, yet his limbs refused to move, as if tethered by invisible chains to the vast emptiness around him. For many within the radius, particularly the auberge and its surroundings, the bartender, the guests that were awake, even Shin flung his eyes wide open from his sleep. Ryan froze, unable to move. It was not the sense of impending death but the sense of oblivion that gnawed at their minds. It was as though they stood at the edge of an abyss, staring into infinite nothingness, where even the concept of existence itself felt meaningless. The fear that Northern's aura evoked was not of pain or suffering but of erasure, complete and utter annihilation of their essence. Around him, the land reacted too. The walls where he stood seemed to groan under the pressure, and insects and small animals that once thrived nearby vanished, sensing what human minds could barely fathom. A force beyond comprehension, a void that hungered for all. And yet, amid the silent chaos, Northern stood untouched. Like the eye of a storm, calm and resolute as his power enveloped the world around him. What did I say about proving your worth to me again? It seems you underestimate me greatly, Revant. Beneath Northern's powerful aura, the fresh tyrant could not utter a word. He shook, painstakingly fighting the urge to resist, at least force his limbs to move. But it was all futile. And then he realized that while he had been subjected to the same emotion he deems himself a tyranny of. Despair. Chapter 496. Master of Chaos. Revant tried to speak, but his mouth was visibly trembling. The words he wanted to utter were falling apart in shambles, and it seemed the situation had rendered him unable to piece them together accurately. His mind was in a severe state of disarray. All he felt was the despair of nothingness. And he was intelligible enough to know what he was feeling because he knew how sweet the taste of despair was. However, being unable to feed on the feeling and being overwhelmed by it filled him with anguish. He had underestimated this human and overestimated his own self. And right now, he didn't even know if he would be given a chance to redeem himself. While it looks like you are quite valuable, it looks to me that your liability outweighs your value. I don't think I want to be served by a liability. Northern's tone and choice of words were carefully chosen. He was not oblivious of the fact that in terms of status alone, Revant was a soul far superior to him. But what did it matter? It was for that reason of superiority that he was intentionally establishing this tone, this choice of words. If he didn't do it now and become intimidated because of Revant's innate status, then he wouldn't gain the respect and fear he needed for Revant to never question him and obey him. Of course, Revant's insult didn't come as a shock. The moment he paused for a minute in the limitless void, He had seen a limited possibility in different timelines of what Revant would do. Some more cruel than this one, which was why he had chosen to send Revant out right now. Allowed him to taste the feeling of others' despair and intentionally entered in time to make him taste his own despair. Instilling fear and asserting the difference between the both of them by his words and his actions. Now that Revant had felt what despair meant through him, he could easily control. For the time being, until Revant gained a significant amount of his power and became rebellious again. Northern knew that Revant was not going to be an easy soul to tame. He thought about it harder again after sending Revant out. Perhaps it would be a better choice to forge his soul into a weapon. But it wouldn't be enough. He didn't want to do that. The enemies he was suspecting that he would be fighting, enemies such as Fate, Cryos, it only made sense that he had a tyrant on his side too. So, he decided that he was going to go through the trouble of beating the tyrant into a shape that he wanted. Until he sees me as his god. Even after Northern had spoken, Revant found it hard to respond under Northern's void aura. Seeing that the tyrant was struggling, "Speak," Northern ordered. Immediately, he felt the ease of opening his mouth and arranging his words come back to him. He lowered his head. This time, his entire presence oozed palpable humility. "If you decide to eliminate my soul, I will bear no regret. However, I beg that you give me a chance to redeem myself. I was mistaken." Northern raised a brow. "Oh? I wasn't expecting such a response." Even though he saw Revant utter those particular words with chaos eyes, he didn't see himself resorting to this means of correction. In fact, Chaos Eyes showed him a very limited future and past, and even more limited when he tried to see other people's future and past. It was as if Chaos Eyes only saw the part filled with chaos. The ability worked to feed chaos to him in the end. Northern had silently used the ability several times on random people while they were journeying to Fugal. And this final act showed him that the future he could see was limited to chaos not as a force but as a cause and effect. This allowed Chaos Eyes to create optimal possibilities from other people's cause and effect of chaos that would benefit him alone. In other words, it fed chaos to him. Hence, it fed the chaos of Revant's future which had just happened to be at the moment, to him. The part he had got to hear Revant's nasty statement about him was just a coincidence that happened, not an intentional thing. In the future, Northern would have to prudently use this ability. For now, he would just ride the wave of this ability until he got the hang of it. But at the very least, he was sure it wouldn't work against his favor. What would, however, work against his own favor were cause and effect that negated chaos, which he can't see. In other words, individual moments of harmony and order. He couldn't think of ways that it would affect him right now, but he was sure that it would come to bite him in one hell of a devious manner. Northern sighed and responded. "I won't decide what to do with you for now. Reflect on what you have done in solitary confinement." At his words, the limitless void usurped Revant from his feet, sucking him into the mold of darkness beneath. Northern watched Revant sink into the limitless void, before entering his own shadows and appearing in the room, where he continued his sleep. In the limitless void, Revant sat cross-legged within the cold and dark embrace of the tall walls, almost close to each other. His eyes were closed, and he was seriously reflecting on his action as Northern had instructed him to. At the same time, thinking and trying to make sense of what he had experienced a few minutes ago. I didn't sense him arriving behind me. No. Has he been watching me the entire time? That was the same movement I used to appear behind the last intruder. It seems he has been watching me from the very beginning, and I had no idea. Revant tightened his shut eyes, his brows furrowing. How is he human? In my memory, I think humans are supposed to be weak and frail. How is it that he is so strong, even though he is clearly a human? What is it that I am not getting? Chapter 497. Effects. Linus raised the axe and plunged it onto the small heap of crystal in front of him, feeling the bloodthirstiness of the crystal lunge at him. This time, his movement was quick, instantly tilting his head to the side to dodge it. A small smile appeared on his face with the successful attempt. Finally, his mind celebrated. Then his smile slowly faded away, becoming a deep scowl. He filled himself with thoughts of how Northern had taken him away from his home, fed anger and hatred to his mind so that he wouldn't get distracted from what Northern had done to him. But in truth, time in this void hadn't been as dreadful as it had looked like it would be. He had been brought to the Red Mountains to mine crystal, and indeed, at first, it had been very hard. So hard that he had refused to do it, until one of the monsters reported him to their taskmaster, which led him to think about the other thing that amazed him about this place. All the monsters in this place had a sense of intelligence. They weren't communicating in human language, particularly in any language as a matter of fact, but they could understand each other with groans and grunts. At first he understood nothing, but right now, he kind of already could tell what they were trying to say by piecing the grunts, groans, and facial expressions together. They were like a community that was not so bad to be with. He had to consistently fill himself with hatred and remind himself that they were monsters for him not to get carried away and start thinking otherwise. With serious beating from the taskmaster who had his eyes embedded in his maws, and after several futile attempts to take down the monster, he eventually gave in, with no choice but to mine as he had been instructed to. He mined and mined and mined, until one day he began to realize he was being cut by the red crystals. The cuts were so sharp that his dull senses had never noted them. Even though Linus felt he was strong and perceptive, he was not perceptive enough to sense the cuts. Only after getting used to them did he begin to perceive them, and because of it, his sense of perception reached a new height. A realization dawned on Linus at that moment. He was weak. He had all the fancy abilities and armor and potential, had learned amazing heritage and gained their abilities, but faced with an ordinary crystal that turned its bloodlust into tiny invisible blades, he was utterly weak. This caused him to humble himself and begin to learn. He began to pay attention to the cuts. After a while, he was able to see them coming. Even though he could see them coming, he wasn't able to avoid them. He tried several thousand times, but it was to no avail. He would give up at a point and just focus on mining, but would soon regain the resolve to continue. Soon, Linus became the most hardworking miner in the red mines. The only breaks he had were meal breaks. Monsters would break a red berry fruit that grew towards the Void Palace, and it tasted really good. He was growing tired of eating just red berry fruits, though, but he could understand why they didn't seem to care. He and his buddies were the only ones they fed, and that red berry fruit was the only thing they were fed. He questioned it but never really understood why the monsters were not eating. They were not eating themselves, nor were they eating the berries. Amidst the wondering, he had focused on mining to the end that he would be able to dodge the attacks. He had also witnessed several things in the process. The sudden cleave of the entire Soulscape, the devastating battle between Northern and a vicious-looking monster that he had no idea what was. And he had seen Northern win each time, which had caused him to question if he would ever be able to defeat a monster of that caliber. At first, he felt hopeless at his situation. The only thing he was willing to do was mine. But recently something happened in the limitless void that he saw happen. Its ominously dark velvety blanket above the Soulscape stretched seemingly endlessly. The monsters began to undergo a subtle change. He couldn't even put his finger around it, but he knew that they had changed. They were more focused, less like monsters and more like humans. They suddenly gained the resolve and reasonability that they never had. It was easier to talk to them. They chuckled within conversation, could sympathize and empathize with themselves. That was not so right. Linus found it harder from that moment to regard them as monsters. To make things worse, plants began to grow on the soil of the limitless void. He was taken on a stroll after working some other time. Since the void was an endless layout of the night, it was impossible to tell when it was day or night. In the red mine, it was always a crimson darkness. In the glacier, it was an azure darkness. The sky from that vantage point, at least, was starry and beautiful, but the cold was a huge bother. And at the volcanic mountain, it was hot and dark, sitting somewhere between a crimson and an azure sky. The place that felt a little bit neutral to be was beside the lake. But the strange lake expelled anything that entered it with double the force of entry, even down to a stone. Everything in the limitless void was utterly dangerous, and he had to learn that by gruesome experience. However, Beside the lake, there was a little plant, slowly trying to fold out. It was too little and insignificant, but it had got Linus thinking. If it continued, this place could be suitable for agriculture. And when that began to happen, common sense would not be able to justify what exactly was happening in this kid's soul. Even with all these impressive things he had seen of Northern, he still refused to acknowledge him in any way. Northern kidnapped him. Northern humiliated him. Northern robbed him of his fate. He would never forgive Northern, even if it was the last thing he would do, even if it would turn everything against him, he would kill Northern. He continued to feed himself such thoughts. Meanwhile, Jessie, since Northern left her in care of the tower, had been doing nothing but fight. Black Mamba was the one that often brought her meal, as usual, the fruit, and she wanted to go out so bad. But she just couldn't. This place was like a world on its own. It was vast and different. Northern must have left her there for a reason, was her thought. And because of that time she began to ruthlessly invest it into training. She would train till her legs gave out, give herself unreasonable drills, running helter-skelter up the tower stairs while carrying boulders. At some point, Black Mamba came very often, even times when he wasn't bringing her food. He would sit down and observe her. Training under the watch of the strange and sinister being always made Jessie uncomfortable, but she would try to do it regardless. At first, it started with only watching. Then one day, while Jessie was tired and out of breath, the being stood up, its skin stretched like liquid, glowing out into its hand to form a spear. Jessie leaned her back against the wall at the time, her eyes closed while she rested. But the moment Black Mamba stood, one of her eyes opened. With an expression of curiosity, she watched the monster form a spear from its own body. Then slowly it took stance. Black Mamba at the initial tryout of the stance looked clueless. He checked his feet, tilting his head in wonder if he got it or not. Jessie had a strange expression on her face, which, when the monster eventually got it, settled into a slight frown. Then step by step, at first sloppy, Jessie watched Black Mamba begin to move the spear, striking into the air with soft and subtle leg movements. His movement at first was large and outrageous. It caused his weight shift to be too much, like his strikes were going to be devastating but not controlled and delivered as intended. The essence of her combat style is to be able to deliver a controlled amount of strike. What she was trying to do now, however, through improvising, is increase the momentum, speed, and power of her strikes such that she is able to skillfully diversify strikes in proportion to the power of her opponent. While she herself needed to be nimble and fiercely strong to pull off something like that, the secret was also embedded in her footwork. She just needed to move and twist her body in a manner that would allow her not just to shift her weight, but shift her weight in such a way that it would affect her speed, momentum, and even timing. Just as she finished thinking about it, Black Mamba moved in an uncanny manner, a manner that caused her to widen her eyes. What? It seems the creature had figured out what she was trying to do. First of all, in few minutes since picking up the sword, it had mastered her combat style, seen its flaw, and improved it just as where she thought it needed improvement. Meanwhile, she had been trying to do the same thing for what felt like eternity. Chapter 498. Ellis's Departure. Northern's sleep was short, but he didn't mind. To be honest, this one even felt so short and peaceful that it felt like a lie. It was also strange and uncomfortable to have a peaceful, undisturbed sleep, without the imminent fear of an impending danger. He woke up, and Ellis had prepared a steaming white bread on the table alongside a warm brownish liquid he called Decoff. This drink Northern had never seen or known about. Actually, now that he thought about it, he hadn't had much to drink except for water and fruit juice which Aisha was adept at making. Thinking of those times he would get home with tea waiting for him made him sentimental, and such sentimentalism caused his expression to fold with darkened resolve. I must find her at all cost. He stood up from the ground and sat on the chair, looked to his side with an irritated expression. What exactly are you doing standing there like that? Ellis, who was standing behind him like an attendant, grinned with pride. I figured that since you let me sleep on the bed, which, by the way, I didn't want, it would have been really cool to sleep together. Ellis, I am not going to sleep together with you. Northern cut him off with a bland, emotionless tone. Ellis's expression contorted with sadness. He mumbled, pouting, "Why do you keep saying it like that? I mean no harm." After a short silence, his eyes regained their life. "But you really should try the bread and decaf. You know decaf, right? It's the kind of beverage drink made from the Iris decaphorium." "Ah, right. I thought the name decaf felt familiar. I remember Mother often calling the tree decaf." Northern was quite familiar with the tree itself. That is because the nectar of its flowers can be used to detoxify poisons. Well, detoxification can be a huge word, since all it does is slow down the effect of the poison till the antidote is administered. And no matter how fast such poison works, the nectar of the decaf tree's flower worked regardless, the same way. Realizing that this is a healthy drink, Northern sighed and gently slipped a finger into the handle of the cup and used 2 other fingers to support the base. Ellis watched him as he sipped and couldn't help but admire. "What an elegant manner of sipping. Stop staring, or else I will splash this on your face. Tisich, you used to be so much fun." Ellis commented begrudgingly and looked away. Next, Northern tasted the bread. As he put the bread in his mouth, his eyes widened terribly. What is this?" he stuttered in his mind as he struggled to comprehend what the taste was. Tasting a divine mix of flour made him realize that, actually, he had been eating monster meat for over a year now. Roasted monster meat. Northern, his eyes shocked and widened, began to shred the bread crudely and fold it into his mouth, before gulping down the decaf. Ellis looked at him and chuckled. He had the exact reaction, so he understood perfectly what Northern was feeling. Whatever it was that they were eating while stranded in the dark continent, they had gotten so used to it that it served as the peak of delicacy. Some monster meat was strangely peak delicacy, while some were severely disgusting to eat. This had created a benchmark of what delicacy was for them, albeit unintentionally. But tasting bread now, it didn't matter if any of them had eaten it before. It's like their taste buds broke into a brand new world after millennia of tormentous food. Northern became less aware of his surroundings and greedily devoured the bread on the table. Eating it like this made him realize he had been hungry all the while. It also made him think about what the humans in his soul would be eating. The monsters didn't need food. They have an everlasting amount of void essence to feed on. A soft knock resounded on the door, causing Northern and Ellis to stand up. Thankfully, Northern stood up with no regrets since he had succeeded in devouring all of the bread without leaving a crumb. If there was any regret he was left with, it was the regret of not being able to have more since they had to leave. Ellis opened the door, allowing Shin and the rest to enter. Shin glanced over both of them. His eyes then came to rest on Northern as he asked, "Did you have a good night? Something strange happened at midnight. It got me worried for a minute." Shin held off on the rest of his words. After the strange feeling at midnight, he had wanted to come and check up on Northern. After rushing towards the door, he belatedly realized how foolish he looked to himself, which caused him to freeze and later go back to sleep. The fact that Northern was strong enough to take care of himself and, as a matter of fact, may have been the source of that devastating atmosphere struck and humbled him. It wasn't a proud feeling, but he had to come to terms with it either way. Behind him, Ryan and Reno stood in the hallway. Ryan, with his usual detached self, and Reno with a slight look of naivety. Throughout the journey, he had been silent and submissive. I felt it too. Aside from that part, I had a great night. Shin nodded. Well then, we can get moving? Yeah. Northern looked at Ellis. You need to part ways now, don't you? Ellis's expression became somber. He folded his hands and stubbornly looked away, stuttering. What do you mean? I'm still going with you. Northern smiled and said to him, It's fine, Ellis. I'm sure your parents have been waiting for you since the first day you left. You've turned out to be a very strong and dependable son. It's time for you to show your family how much you've grown. I believe we will see each other again. I will need you after all. But for now, your family needs you. Ellis's face crumpled, streams of tears running down his eyes and nose. He sniffed and rushed to hug Northern, who stood still without a flinch and silently tolerated the young boy who had always, since the beginning, tolerated him without complaints. Northern's mind raced through it all, causing him to sigh and raise a hand to pat Ellis's back. "You will call me if you need me, right?" Ellis spoke with a muffled voice due to all the cries and mucus in his nose. "Yes, Ellis. I will definitely come for you when I need you." Chapter 499. Smartass. Reno raised his hand, a trace of a smile leaving his face. "I'm going to be parting here too." Ellis grimaced at him. "You are not getting any hugs. This is mine alone. Knock yourself out, kid." Northern looked at him with no particular emotion in his eyes. "I guess it has been a ride." "Yes, it has. Thank you so much for your help." Reno paused, growing silent. His eyes fell for a moment and rose with a wistful expression on his face. "To be honest," the air was silent and wafted with suspense as he started. "I never actually thought you would live." Northern raised a brow inquisitively. "If anything, I thought you and Raven and Helena were going to be the first set of people to die." His eyes fell again as his words continued, carrying a sentimental air. "I was scared. I survived by sticking close to Afcon. My invisibility transcended into my personality and lifestyle. I hid and ran away from everything that happened in Stelia. I contributed not even in the slightest. And I am ashamed to be facing you like this." "And so what?" Northern interrupted, making Reno lift his head to meet Northern's gaze. "So what if you hid from everything? You think if I had an ability that gives me perfect invisibility like yours, I'd fight?" Reno's eyes widened, not understanding what Northern was saying. This wasn't quite the reaction he expected. "I'm envious of you, to be honest. You can just steal cores from slain monsters, hide in a cave or something, and not really endanger yourself." The more Northern spoke, the more shocked Reno was by what Northern was saying. "How?" Northern was undeniably one of the major driving forces of the battle. His monster, Night Terror, and several people spoke of how he killed a being they could not kill with barely 2 strikes. When he heard people talk about him, they all spoke about him like he was a celebrity. Apparently, he had single-handedly defeated a Tier V rift. Some say he even defeated all the monsters in Lothellowen and single-handedly beat all the party leaders at the time. They say even Gilbert is scared of his strength. They say the only person that can match his power is the amazing Lady Raven. Even Annette respects him. Of course, Reno didn't believe all those talks were true. But the fact was that, in these talks, the message that went around more was the astounding power that Northern possessed. He was strong, and everybody respected him. Now, such a person who against all odds had pushed forward, while he had hidden under the excuse of not being good on the battlefield. His expression was filled with confusion. Northern, looking at his face, asked with a scowl, "What? I thought you would chastise me? You were there. You saw how cowardly I was. I'm not enjoying this. If you want me to start scolding you or judging you for being a coward, then you are not going to have that. One thing I am learning to not be is a hypocrite. I have been a coward too, and I don't think there's anything wrong with being a coward as long as you preserve your life." He shot a deep stare at Reno, who staggered back by a step, eyes widened. "It's like someone peeked into my soul." Northern took a few steps closer, reaching the entrance where Reno was standing. "What does need chastising, however, is the lack of resolve. If by now you don't despise yourself enough to want to grow, then you should have died back in Stelia, alongside Afcon whom you couldn't betray. Let's go." Northern walked out of the room without waiting for anyone. His last words were harsh, so harsh that it made the atmosphere heavy. Everyone else felt pity for Reno, who had to hear something like that. Of course, everyone except Ryan, who had a forlorn look on his face. Shin bade Ellis farewell and tapped Reno's shoulder on his way out. Ryan just went away silently, leaving Reno and Ellis in the room. It was awkward for a bit, but Ellis also managed to slip out. Reno was left. He sighed and looked up, then gritted his teeth. Soon, a smile parted his lips. The expression that warranted pity on his face faded away, replaced by a determined fire burning in his eyes. "Thanks, Sir Northern. That was all I needed to hear." He clenched his fist hard before leaving the room. Northern, Shin, Ryan, and Ellis checked out of the Aberds together. As they got out, Ellis waved them goodbye and trekked towards the left road. Afterwards, Northern and Ryan followed Shin towards the right. Now that it was daylight, the city called South Drywall could be vividly seen, a beauty that transcended what he had seen so far. But of course, Northern had not seen so much beauty as of now. South Drywall was a city etched beneath the towering spires of a grand citadel, unfurled in a breathtaking sprawl. A tapestry of ancient stone and sun-baked rooftops that gleamed in the morning light. The heart of the city was dominated by a colossal castle, its skyward-reaching towers piercing the clouds like the fingers of a divine hand. Each turret and spire was intricately carved, tracing patterns that seemed to dance and shift with the sun's path across the sky. The castle was a marvel of architecture, melding both elegance and power, standing as an ever-watchful guardian over the labyrinthine streets below. It was built amidst the city such that there was no angle from which the turret could not be seen. From the base of the citadel, a grand boulevard stretched outward like a river of cobblestones, bustling with the vibrant life of the city. Merchants, adorned in fine silks and rough-spun wool alike, haggled beneath colorful awnings, their goods ranging from exotic spices to finely wrought jewelry that caught the sun like stars. The scent of fresh bread and roasted meats intermingled with the salt-tinged breeze that wafted in from distant rivers and canals that wove their way through the outer districts. Every building was a masterpiece in its own right, an ode to the ages past yet resonant with the vitality of the present. Gothic towers and graceful arches stood shoulder to shoulder with humble homes of stone and timber, their red-tiled roofs dotted with moss and ivy. Alongside narrow alleyways, intricate bridges arched over serene canals, linking the various districts like threads in a well-woven tapestry. The constant trickle of water beneath, a melody as ancient as the city itself, provided a soothing counterpoint to the lively chorus of citizens that filled the streets. The city sprawled outward in every direction, a seemingly endless maze of districts that radiated from the castle's imposing center. To the north, vast plains stretched towards distant snow-capped mountains, their jagged peaks piercing the horizon. To the south, a wide river curved lazily through the landscape, its waters shimmering like molten silver under the light. What, however, was most eye-catching was the grandeur of the castle. Northern, for some reason, couldn't help but stare at the tall spires. He turned to his dad for a minute. If I remember very well, South Drywall is dominated by a citadel named Therion, right? Yes. Why do you ask? Northern narrowed his eyes. Is it possible for us to go there? Shin stopped, puzzled. Well, what I had in mind was going to a discreet intel organization. They are reputable for holding information on every nook and cranny in the Central Plains. And yet, Therion sits dominant over South Drywall. Shin was still confused. He wasn't getting what point Northern was trying to make. Then Ryan inputted. Shouldn't they naturally pay obeisance to Therion? If Therion is strong enough to rule over South Drywall, then I think this intel organization would have been a major part of that possibility, or could this intel organization just be another face of Therion? Northern looked at Ryan, eyes widened. Then he smiled unbelievably. Crap, he's smart. Chapter 500, The Canopy of Citadels. 1567. Era of Kings. Exactly 100 years ago, the rate of rift appearance became abnormally high, and not even the Academy and nations could do anything significant about it. The most they could do was protect their citizens and kingdoms. And who could blame them? Even the great empire of Riemgard was limited in the things they could do to help independent areas, outskirts, and weaker nations. A man rose from nowhere at the time. This man raised an army of drifters himself and began to lead them into rifts, plundering rift after rift. And when people heard that this man was a paragon, they fearlessly fought by his side. Soon, he was respected across nations. Weaker nations were under his dominance, and greater nations couldn't ignore his significance anymore. All of them wanted him. They wanted the might of a paragon. Not to mention, he was one hell of a strong man, who was not even intimidated by the Emperor of Riemgard at the time. Many more began to join his army. At the time, they called themselves the Revolutionaries. And they wanted to revolutionize the age of monarchs. The march and defeat of more and more rifts, regardless of tiers, led more drifters to join their ranks. Even prestigious drifters who graduated from the academy couldn't resist the call to a new age. Soon, a banner was raised, giving birth to a canopy known as the Citadel. Soon, that citadel became a canopy that not only covered and protected drifters but also managed them. This was after the Paragon and the strongest drifters in this revolutionary army came together to form a round table of officials and called themselves the government that would govern the authority of the kings. Of course, an endearing act such as this rose an age of war where kingdoms allied to put down this great force. But they witnessed the power of people such that even soldiers and knights believed in the age that this man preached and became a part of the revolutionary army. And through it all, the empire sat out of all of it. Many kings suspected that the emperor had struck some kind of deal with this man, because all their hope was on the fact that one movement from the empire was going to quench this frivolous movement. Their hopes were shattered when the empire did not interfere no matter what happened. It was during this age that several nations lost their territory, the term free territory became a thing, and cities began to demand monopoly. After the government was established, the citadel became an even stronger forte. Branches were built in every city to oversee the appearance of rifts and assemble and dispatch drifters who would immediately venture into these rifts and close them. It was then essential for a drifter to be under the canopy of a citadel to function as they ought. They provided drifters with the fundamental knowledge and techniques they needed to be able to kill a monster, protect themselves, and survive in a rift. Over the flow of time, their influence grew, coalescing to build a stark authority over rifts for them, one that nations did not even have. A citadel became an essential need for every drifter, both those that attended and graduated from the academy, and those that didn't. Of course, this feat was led by a man known as the Major Asentals Ghaffar. The first government official to become a paragon and also, at the time, was the Major General of the army. Moreover, he was a force that unified those that wanted to be released from the rule of kings. He then created the ideology that the people could choose their own leader. This unified force became a country where the people were granted the free will to choose their own leader by a system of voting. His age was truly the age of the government. Monarchs shivered at the sound of his voice. He was a force that no one could resist reckoning with. Sadly, he led a voyage to the northern continent, from which he never came back. No one knows if he even ever made it. But one of his feats was making everything that the drifter needed to do in order to be a drifter revolve around the citadel. However, after his death, his partners began to fall into corruption. They wanted to rule, they manipulated the people and their choices. Soon, their greed led to their division. Influential officials and drifters began to demand the right to break away from the citadel and create a citadel of their own, one that operated on private grounds. And over time, private citadels came into existence. Families and clans came together to create their own citadels, buying from the government the right to own a rift and function as a citadel ought to. This caused the government to lose their significance, although the usurped authority of monarchs was not returned to them. Instead, it was a new rise of power. Clans raised their banners, and the world progressed into an age where clans gained enough power to conquer even nations, by raising armies, accepting and adopting drifters, all for the purpose of building the strongest. This age was the rise of influential clans such as the Kageyama clan, the Johnson, Beeson, Astaroth, Straville, and several other clans that held authorities that could rival nations. This new age gave birth to new and untamable ideologies, where private citadels rose to usurp authority from the government in a certain city if their activities were being hindered, and public citadels rose to usurp authority of a city from a nation if their activities were also being hindered. It was just a matter of controlling what the people think they wanted for themselves. As it turns out, to control the desires of people was a very easy thing to do. The other part of it that was not easy, however, was gaining incredibly strong drifters, which was why even till now, citadels are always on the lookout for strong drifters, ones with the potential to become a paragon before they die, lose a limb, or retire. Because with a paragon among them, a citadel could even overtake a nation and no one would interfere. Even though the Intel organization was not exclusively a citadel, they operated on almost the same ground. Therion rose and usurped South Drywall from the Drywall Kingdom. Northern didn't want to believe that was just an ordinary phenomenon. And just as he stared at the Citadel's spires, a gruesome past played out quickly before his eyes. A carnage that was spewed for this citadel to rise above this city. He didn't have all his answers from the vision of the past, but what he saw posed a notion that there is no way in hell that Therion would know that this discrete organization exists and not have eradicated them. Or else this discrete organization was Therion itself. Now, what exactly was the problem of all this? Northern just didn't like the fact that he was going to be monitored and lied to. Intel organizations were meant to function as ghosts, for the sole purpose of providing information at a cost. If the Intel organization truly works for Therion, then it is Therion's method of monitoring every single thing that goes on in the city. Northern didn't want to have anyone snooping around his ass. So, he'd prefer to go straight into the eyes of the storm, of course, not without a plan. However, what just surprised him was Ryan's thought. Northern had known of Therion and the Intel organization link through his eyes. But surely, Ryan would have pieced things together just by what he knew. Northern did not know he was that smart. In fact, Northern realized now, he didn't even know Ryan at all.